Somewhere beneath the North Atlantic, in water so cold and so dark that sunlight never reaches the bottom, there are ships that have not moved in more than 80 years. Merchant vessels, tankers, cargo carriers, each one resting on the seabed exactly where it came to rest on the day it was struck, and scattered across thousands of kilometers of ocean floor, among the twisted steel and the scattered cargo, are the wrecks of the submarines that hunted them, U-boats, German submarines that prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs and alone, that surfaced in the dark and dove before dawn, that killed without warning and were killed in return. Most of them are still down there. Most of their crews never came home. This is not a story about victory. It is not a story about a man who saved the world or changed the course of history with a single bold decision. It is something quieter than that, and in some ways more unsettling. It is the story of a man who was extraordinarily good at something the world needed him to stop doing. A man who rose to the very top of a brutal, technical, and unforgiving profession, survived dangers that killed the vast majority of his peers, and then did not die at sea at all. He died behind a fence, in a field, in the middle of America, in a country he had spent years trying to strangle from the ocean. Werner Henke, Kapitänleutnant, U-boat commander, ace of the Atlantic. If you are settling in for the night, you have chosen a good story to carry you there. Long, measured, full of the kind of detail that rewards patience. We are going to start at the beginning, a small industrial city in Germany during a period of extraordinary national suffering, and we are going to follow one man across 3 decades, 2 continents, and an ocean that was, for a few years in the middle of the 20th century, the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. We are going to watch him learn his trade, master it, and then watch the world change around him faster than any amount of skill or courage could compensate for. And at the end, we are going to sit with what his story actually means, not just as military history, but as a portrait of a human life shaped and ultimately consumed by forces far larger than one man. There is something about the U-boat war that has always drawn people in. Perhaps it is the claustrophobia of it, the idea of 50 men sealed inside a steel cylinder, breathing recycled air, listening to the sound of propellers overhead, waiting to find out whether the next explosion would be close enough to kill them. Perhaps it is the strange intimacy of submarine warfare, the way a crew lived and worked and suffered in a space smaller than most apartments, where there was nowhere to go and no way to pretend that death was not a realistic possibility on any given day. Or perhaps it is simply the mathematics of it, the staggering losses on both sides, the convoys stretching across hundreds of kilometers of open water, the cat-and-mouse geometry of hunter and hunted played out beneath the waves. By the time the war ended, the Kriegsmarine had commissioned roughly 1,100 U-boats. Of those, more than 800 were lost. More than 30,000 German submariners died at sea. The mortality rate for U-boat crews across the full course of the war was somewhere around 75%. 3 out of every 4 men who climbed down a conning tower hatch and went on patrol did not survive the war. That is not a statistic that belongs in a dry history textbook. That is a number that should stop you for a moment. 3 out of 4. Werner Henke was one of the 1 in 4. He survived patrols that killed men with more experience. He survived depth charge attacks that cracked equipment, rattled men's nerves, and drove submarines to the edge of their crush depth. He survived the years when Allied anti-submarine technology was primitive and the Atlantic felt like it belonged to the U-boats. And he survived the years when that technology had become so sophisticated that a submarine could be detected, tracked, and destroyed before its crew even knew an aircraft was overhead. He survived all of it. He survived the war. And then, in the summer of 1945, in a prisoner of war camp in the state of Oklahoma, he was killed by fellow German prisoners who believed he had collaborated with his American captors. The ocean could not take him. His own men did. That irony is not a simple one, and we are not going to treat it as simple. By the time we reach that chapter of this story, you will understand the pressures that produced it, the fractured loyalties inside German POW camps, the desperate ideology of men who had lost everything and still refused to admit it, the impossible position of an officer who had earned genuine respect through skill and courage, but who found himself on the wrong side of a political line drawn by other prisoners in a field in the American interior. The circumstances of Henke's death are complicated, and they deserve to be treated that way. But we will get there. We have a long way to travel first. We are going to begin in the Ruhr Valley, in the years between the two world wars, when Germany was a country in genuine crisis, economically, politically, psychologically. We are going to understand where Henke came from, because where a person comes from always matters. We are going to follow him through naval training, through his early years as a watch officer, learning the rhythms of submarine service, through his first command and his first confirmed sinkings, and the slow accumulation of a reputation that would eventually make his name known throughout the German submarine fleet. We are going to spend time on the Atlantic, on the surface and below it, and try to convey what that experience actually felt like, not in abstract tactical terms but in human ones. The cold, the waiting, the sound of a convoy's propellers at a distance of several kilometers, growing louder, the decision of when to attack and when to disappear. And then we are going to watch the war change. We are going to watch Allied technology close around the U-boat fleet like a fist, systematically, relentlessly, until the submarines that had once operated with relative freedom were fighting for survival on every patrol. We are going to watch Henke adapt, as good commanders do, and we are going to watch the point at which adaptation is no longer enough, when the math simply no longer works in your favor, no matter how skilled you are. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have been with us before, you already know what kind of documentary this is. Thorough, unhurried, built for the long hours of the night when the world is quiet, and a story like this one can breathe properly. Hit subscribe if you want more. We cover the full sweep of the Second World War and beyond, always with the same commitment to detail and the same respect for the human beings inside the history. There is a lot more to come. For now, get comfortable. Let the screen dim if you need it to. We are heading back to the beginning, to a Germany that was broken and angry, and searching for someone to believe in, to a boy growing up in the industrial heartland who looked toward the sea as the way out, toward something cleaner and more ordered than the chaos around him. We are going to follow that boy all the way to the bottom of the Atlantic and back up again, and then across an ocean in the wrong direction, and into a field in Oklahoma where his story ended in a way that nobody, least of all Werner Henke, could have predicted. This is his story, all of it, from the very beginning. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over industrial towns in the hours before dawn. Not the silence of countryside or open water, but a held breath, the pause between one shift and the next, the moment when the furnaces cool just slightly and the air carries the smell of coal dust and damp stone. In the Ruhr Valley of Germany, in the years following the First World War, that silence was filled with something heavier than fatigue. It carried the weight of a nation that had lost everything it believed about itself. The men who had marched away with flags and certainty had come home to find the ground beneath them had shifted, and what replaced the old confidence was something rawer and more volatile, a grief that had not yet decided what shape it would take. It was into this world that Werner Henke was born. The Ruhr in those years was not a gentle place to grow up. It was a region built on iron and coal, on the labor of men who descended into the earth each morning and emerged each evening, carrying something of the darkness with them. The factories along the valley floor ran in long shifts, and the towns that clustered around them had a particular grey quality. Not grim exactly, but functional, in the way that places become when survival has been the primary concern for so long that beauty becomes a secondary thought. The streets were narrow, the buildings solid and close together, and in the years of the Weimar Republic they were also frequently volatile. Political meetings spilled out of meeting halls and into the streets. Pamphlets changed hands on corners. Arguments that began over wages or bread prices ended somewhere much more fundamental, over what Germany was and what it was supposed to become. The economic catastrophe that gripped Germany in the early 1920s did not spare the Ruhr. Hyperinflation reduced savings to paper fiction almost overnight. Families who had scraped and planned through years of austerity watched those plans dissolve into worthlessness. The money in a man's wallet in the morning might buy nothing recognizable by the afternoon. For a child growing up in this environment, the instability was not an abstract concept reported in newspapers. It was the texture of daily life, the tension in the faces of adults who tried to keep their voices calm when the news was anything but. A generation of German children absorbed this uncertainty into their bones, and it shaped them in ways that would not fully reveal themselves for another decade. Young Werner Henke grew up within reach of all of this, and yet something in him seems to have oriented itself toward the horizon rather than the valley floor. There is something almost consistent in the biographies of men who become sailors, a particular restlessness that domestic geography cannot satisfy, a pull toward distance that is difficult to explain and almost impossible to argue with. Whether Henke first encountered the idea of the sea through books or maps or the occasional visit to a port city, something in it caught hold of him in a way that the factories and the politics of the Ruhr did not. The sea represented something his immediate world could not offer: scale, motion, the possibility of being somewhere fundamentally different from where you started. This was not an unusual aspiration for young German men of his generation, though it was one that required ambition to pursue seriously. Germany had a naval tradition that ran deeper than its recent military history might suggest. The Imperial Navy had been a point of national pride before the First World War, and its humiliation, both in the conflict itself and in the enforced surrenders and restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, had not diminished the romance of naval service in the minds of those who had been too young to fight. If anything, the prohibition and limitation imposed on German military capability in the years that followed made service in what naval forces remained seem more charged, more significant. For a boy with ambitions and a temperament drawn to discipline and purpose, the Navy offered something that civilian life in a struggling industrial town could not easily match. Germany in the late 1920s and into the 1930s was a country in convulsion. The Weimar Republic, fragile from its founding and battered by economic disaster and political extremism from every direction, was losing its grip. The streets that had once hosted competing pamphlets now hosted something more organized and more threatening. The nationalist movements that had been fermenting throughout Henke's childhood began to consolidate, and the language of national humiliation, the stab in the back, the debt imposed by enemies, the recovery that was coming if only the right men were given power, became the dominant register of public life. A young man coming of age in this environment could not have been unaffected by it. The question was never whether the politics would touch him, but how. What we know is that Henke's path led him toward military service rather than away from it. The Kriegsmarine, the reconstituted German navy that emerged as the restrictions of Versailles were progressively dismantled, was building itself into a fighting force again, and it needed officers. The naval academies of the 1930s were shaping a generation of men who would, within a few years, find themselves at sea in conditions those academies could only partially prepare them for. Henke entered this world as a young officer cadet, part of a cohort that was simultaneously inheriting a military tradition and building something new from its foundations. The training was rigorous, the expectations demanding, and the culture of the officer corps carried within it assumptions about discipline, loyalty, and national purpose that were difficult to separate from the broader ideological environment of the time. The Kriegsmarine of this period carried its own particular culture, distinct in some ways from the army and the political apparatus that increasingly dominated German life, yet also embedded within the same national project. Naval officers prided themselves on a certain professionalism, a technical competence and operational focus that, in their own telling, existed somewhat apart from the cruder political energies around them. Whether this self-understanding was accurate or convenient is a question that the history of the war would eventually complicate considerably. But for a young Henke, entering this world in the 1930s, it offered a coherent identity, the naval officer as craftsman of war, defined by skill and execution rather than ideology. The sea itself was part of the formation. For young men who had grown up in landlocked industrial towns, exposure to the actual ocean, its scale, its indifference, its capacity to make human concerns feel small, was transformative in ways that were both practical and something harder to name. The North Sea and the Baltic, where early training took place, were not gentle teachers. They demanded attention, physical endurance, and the kind of situational awareness that could not be taught from a textbook. Henke would have learned, as all naval cadets learned, that the water held no ideology and respected no rank. It demanded competence, and it punished negligence with a consistency that no other environment could match. In this way, the sea began to do what the Ruhr could not. It gave Henke a framework for measuring himself against something objective. A convoy approach executed correctly worked, or it did not. A trim angle achieved with precision made the boat efficient, or it did not. There was a clarity to naval competence that the murky politics of civilian life could not offer, and for men with a certain temperament, methodical, technically minded, focused, this clarity was enormously appealing. It would become the defining feature of Henke's approach to submarine command years later in conditions that neither he nor anyone else in those training exercises could have fully imagined. By the time he completed his initial training and began moving through the lower ranks of the Kriegsmarine, Germany itself had changed almost beyond recognition. The Weimar Republic was gone, replaced by a government that spoke constantly of national destiny and military renewal. The navy that Henke was entering was no longer rebuilding under constraint. It was expanding with intent, constructing vessels, and training crews for a conflict that the leadership increasingly treated not as a possibility, but as a plan. The boy from the Ruhr who had looked toward the horizon was now a young officer looking at charts and depth readings and the tactical manuals of submarine warfare. The distance between those two things, the childhood longing and the professional reality, was vast, and also, in some ways, not so far at all. Both were expressions of the same impulse, the desire to move through the world with purpose, to navigate rather than simply endure, to make some claim on the forces that shaped a life rather than being shaped entirely by them. What that impulse would cost him, and others, was a story still waiting to be written. The German Navy that Werner Henke stepped into during the 1930s was not the Navy it appeared to be on paper. To outside observers, the Kriegsmarine was a modest force, constrained by the terms laid down at Versailles, hemmed in by treaty language that limited tonnage and prohibited entire categories of warship. But beneath that surface, something was being rebuilt with quiet urgency. Officers were being trained, doctrines were being written, and a generation of young men with seawater in their blood were being prepared for a conflict that Germany's leadership had already decided was coming. Henke arrived into this atmosphere not as an innocent, but as a young man who understood, at least instinctively, that the institution he was joining was in the business of becoming something larger than it currently was. The Navy rewarded that kind of ambition. It cultivated it deliberately, selecting candidates who combined technical aptitude with the emotional steadiness required to function under pressure. Henke, by all available accounts, fit that profile from the beginning. Naval Academy in the 1930s was a rigorous and deliberately demanding experience. The curriculum was built not merely to teach navigation or gunnery, but to strip away everything soft in a young man and replace it with discipline, precision, and an unshakable faith in procedure. Cadets were expected to memorize vast quantities of technical data while simultaneously mastering the physical demands of seamanship, enduring long watches, heavy weather exercises, and the kind of institutional hierarchy that tolerated no casual relationship with rank or authority. For a boy who had grown up in the Ruhr during the worst years of Weimar's collapse, this environment was not a shock. It was, in many respects, a relief. Order had a value that chaos had long since destroyed in the Germany of his childhood, and the academy offered order in almost architectural form. Henke absorbed it. He advanced through the early stages of his training without distinction that drew particular attention, but without the stumbles that ended other careers before they began. What set certain cadets apart in this period was not always raw brilliance, but rather the combination of patience and hunger. The Navy was full of intelligent young officers who lacked the temperament to wait. They wanted commands, operations, recognition, and they wanted them before they had earned the judgment to use them well. Henke appeared to understand something that his more impetuous peers did not, that every posting before command was a classroom. Every superior officer, even the mediocre ones, had something to teach about what worked and what failed at sea. The watch hours accumulated, the technical knowledge deepened, and Henke built the foundation of what would eventually become a highly individual operational style. He was not passive during this period. He asked questions, studied reports, and paid close attention to the tactical literature that was circulating through the Kriegsmarine's officer corps during those years of accelerating preparation. The submarine arm, by the late 1930s, had become the most intellectually intense corner of German naval ambition. The Treaty of Versailles had banned Germany from operating U-boats entirely, but when rearmament began in earnest, and those restrictions were progressively abandoned, the submarine force was rebuilt with something close to evangelical intensity. The man most responsible for that effort was Karl Dönitz, who had commanded U-boats during the Great War, spent years as a prisoner of the British, and returned to Germany with a conviction that the submarine was the decisive weapon of a future naval war. Dönitz built his force around a concept he called the Wolf Pack, groups of submarines operating in coordinated fashion against convoys, directed by radio from shore, able to overwhelm the defenses that a single boat could not. This was not yet the navy that young officers like Henke were fully operating within during the academy years, but its ideas were already in the air, already shaping how the submarine service thought about itself. Henke's transition into specialized submarine training brought him into direct contact with this philosophy. The physical experience of submarine service was unlike anything surface warfare prepared a man for. Below the water, the parameters of every tactical decision changed completely. Speed, range, visibility, and communication all operated by different rules, and the margin for error was far smaller than anything encountered on a destroyer or a cruiser. A surface ship that made a mistake might be damaged. A submarine that made a mistake in the wrong circumstances simply disappeared. The training was designed to drive that reality as deeply as possible into the consciousness of every officer, not to frighten them out of the service, but to ensure that when they operated at depth, with an escort pounding them overhead, the responses were reflexive rather than deliberated. Henke was trained to think in 3 dimensions, to understand his boat as a system of interdependent components, any one of which, if it failed, could kill everyone aboard. The crew dynamic inside a submarine was unlike that of any other fighting vessel. The spaces were so confined, the mission so consistently life-threatening, and the dependence of every man on every other man so total, that a commanding officer who failed to command genuine respect rather than merely formal deference was a dangerous liability. Henke learned this not from a manual, but from watching officers above him. Some officers held their crews through fear, and those crews performed adequately in calm conditions and fell apart under pressure. Others built something closer to a professional compact, where every man understood his role precisely and trusted that the officer in the conning tower had earned the right to make the decisions that would bring them home. Henke studied both models. He was not a warm man by instinct, but he was a fair one, and he understood that fairness, in the brutal economy of submarine warfare, had a direct operational value. His early postings as a watch officer placed him aboard operational boats at a time when the war had already begun. The Atlantic was not yet the killing ground it would become, but the early patrols of 1939 and 1940 were already establishing the patterns that would define the conflict's naval dimension. Henke stood his watches and observed. He observed how commanders handled the stress of a contact, how they managed their crew through the long, grinding hours of tracking a convoy, how they made the decision to attack, and how they absorbed the violence of a counterattack. Some of what he saw impressed him. Some of it he filed away as what not to do. The hesitations, the overconfidence, the failure to manage information clearly in the chaos of a depth charge attack. Every patrol was an education, and Henke was, above all else, a diligent student. The technological vocabulary he was accumulating during these years would later become the foundation of his tactical identity. He developed a detailed understanding of his boat's acoustic profile, of how different speeds and different depths changed the signature that an enemy hydrophone could detect. He learned the behavior of thermal layers in the Atlantic, bands of water where temperature differentials caused sound to bend and scatter in ways that could confuse enemy sonar. He studied torpedo geometry obsessively, because a missed shot was not merely a tactical failure, but a logistical one. Every torpedo carried was finite. Every miss was a reduction in the boat's effective combat power. These were not abstract concerns to a watch officer. He was in the fire control party, making the calculations, checking the settings, learning the feel of the weapon before he would ever have the authority to order it used. The Atlantic in those early years had a quality that experienced submariners would later describe with a kind of bitter nostalgia. The convoy systems were not yet fully coordinated. Air cover over the mid-Atlantic was sparse to non-existent. The escort vessels were frequently not equipped with the latest detection technology, and the tactical doctrines for hunting submarines were still being worked out through painful trial and error. A skilled U-boat commander operating in those conditions had genuine advantages, and the tonnage being sent to the bottom during the period German submariners called the happy time reflected exactly that imbalance. Henke watched this war and absorbed its lessons at precisely the moment when those lessons were most clearly available, before the Allies adapted, before the technology shifted, before the ocean itself became a different kind of battlefield. What he also absorbed, though perhaps less consciously at this stage, was the institutional culture of the U-boat arm. Dönitz had built something closer to a brotherhood than a conventional military formation. The losses were already severe even in the early years, and the shared knowledge of those losses created a particular kind of solidarity. Men who went down together were mourned together, and those who survived developed relationships forged in the specific crucible of extended underwater operations. Henke was not yet a commander within this community, but he was becoming a member of it. He was learning its language, its values, its dark humor, and its unstated rules about what was owed to the men who served below decks, and what was owed to the mission above all other considerations. By the time his assignment to command came into view, Henke had spent years in the intermediate positions that most naval careers are actually made of, far from glory, close to the machinery, learning the ocean from the inside. He had not yet been tested in the way that command would test him. He had not yet made the decisions that could not be unmade, or sat alone at the center of a crisis with every man on the boat waiting for him to speak. But he had prepared for those moments as thoroughly as the system allowed. He understood his boat. He understood his weapon. He understood, in the way that only close observation over time can teach, how the gap between a good officer and a great one was measured not in courage, but in the quality of the thinking that happened in the seconds before action. The Atlantic was waiting. His own boat was waiting. And Werner Henke, shaped now by the academy and the patrols and the years of patient accumulation, was as ready as a man could be for what was coming next. There is a particular silence that falls over a submarine pen the moment a new commander steps aboard his boat for the first time. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of expectation, the kind that presses against the ears and sits heavy in the chest. When Werner Henke walked the length of U-415 in the early months of 1942, he would have felt every eye in that crew quietly measuring him. They had served under other men. They knew the rhythms of the deep already, the sounds of compressed air cycling through ballast tanks, the groan of the pressure hull as depth increased. What they did not yet know was whether this particular officer, this methodical and ambitious man from the Ruhr, was someone they could trust their lives to. That question would only be answered in the Atlantic, and the Atlantic, in 1942, had very clear ways of forcing answers from men who thought they were ready. U-415 was a Type 7C submarine, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's underwater fleet. It was a vessel built not for comfort but for function. Tight passageways, bunks stacked in overlapping rows, every centimeter of interior space allocated to equipment, torpedo storage, or the mechanical systems that kept the boat alive beneath the water. A crew of roughly 4 men lived inside that steel tube, breathing recycled air, eating food from lockers packed wherever space allowed, sleeping in shifts because there simply were not enough beds for every man at once. The smell below decks was a combination of diesel oil, damp wool, and human exhaustion that never quite left the nostrils of anyone who served aboard. For Henke, Taking command of this vessel meant accepting not just responsibility for a weapons platform, but responsibility for the lives of every man breathing that particular air. That weight settled onto experienced commanders quickly. It settled onto new ones even faster. His orders placed him within the broader operational framework that Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz had constructed around the concept of wolf pack coordination, though individual commanders retained significant tactical autonomy during a patrol once they had located a target. The year 1942 was, in many respects, the high watermark of German U-boat effectiveness in the Atlantic. American convoy protections were still being organized and improved. Air coverage over the mid-Atlantic Gap, that wide corridor of ocean where land-based aircraft from either side could not reliably reach, remained thin enough that submarines could operate on the surface for extended periods, recharging batteries and moving quickly toward reported convoy positions. It was a world that rewarded aggressiveness, tempered by patience, and it was the world into which Henke sailed on his maiden patrol as a commanding officer. The opportunity was genuine. The danger was equally so. What strikes historians reviewing the operational records of this period is the sheer physical and psychological demand placed on a submarine commander during a patrol. Henke was not simply navigating a vessel. He was managing competing streams of information at all times, hydrophone contacts from his sound operators, weather reports that influenced whether the boat could run surfaced at night, signals traffic from Dönitz's headquarters at Lorient, and the constant mechanical state of his own boat, which could develop faults in any of its dozens of interdependent systems at any hour. A commander who failed to integrate all of this, who became fixated on any single element at the expense of the whole, could find himself in a position from which there was no recovery. The captains who survived long enough to accumulate experience were the ones who had developed something close to an instinct for proportion, knowing which problem demanded immediate attention and which could wait 5 minutes without becoming catastrophic. Henke's training had prepared him intellectually for these demands. The maiden patrol would teach him whether he could meet them in practice. The Atlantic crossing itself was the first lesson. Moving a submarine from a French port across the Bay of Biscay and out into open ocean required navigating through waters that were already growing more contested as Allied air patrols out of Britain and Portugal extended their reach. A boat running surface to conserve battery charge was visible from the air, and the response time from a patrolling aircraft could be measured in seconds rather than minutes once a sighting was made. Henke would have drilled his crew relentlessly in the crash dive procedure, the sequence of actions that could take a submarine from full surface running to periscope depth in well under a minute when executed properly. Every second shaved from that sequence was a margin against an aircraft bomb or a strafing run. The crew's ability to execute that procedure without hesitation, in the dark, half asleep, was one of the fundamental survival skills of the U-boat service. Henke's maiden crossing tested those skills against the real uncertainty of when or whether a threat would materialize. Once into the open Atlantic, the nature of the operation shifted. The boat would settle into its patrol routine, periods of submerged travel during daylight hours to avoid air observation, surfacing at night to run on diesel engines, charge batteries, ventilate the hull, and give exhausted men a few minutes of cold, salt-heavy ocean air that felt miraculous after hours below. Navigation was conducted by celestial observation when conditions allowed, and by dead reckoning otherwise, the careful calculation of position based on known speed, heading, and time elapsed since the last confirmed fix. Errors compounded over days. A commander who allowed his navigation to drift could find himself searching for convoy routes that were simply not where his charts said they should be. The Atlantic offered no landmarks, no margin for sloppy arithmetic. Henke's mathematical precision, something already noted by his instructors during training, found a natural application in the patience demanded by open ocean navigation. His first contact with a convoy presented the kind of compressed decision-making that no amount of classroom preparation fully replicated. The geometry of an attack approach, positioning the boat ahead of the convoy's projected track, accounting for the speed of the target, the angle of the bow, the running depth and speed of torpedoes, the likely patrol patterns of the escort vessels ringing the merchant ships, required rapid mental calculation under conditions of rising stress. Henke had studied these problems extensively. He had practiced them aboard other boats as a watch officer, but practice and execution are separated by the physical reality of the moment. The sound of propellers through the hull, the voices of his crew reporting contacts and depths, the knowledge that an incorrect firing solution meant not just a missed shot, but a position compromised, a boat now hunted. The first torpedoes he fired as a commanding officer carried all of that compressed weight. The tactical lessons that emerged from this maiden patrol were ones that Henke would carry forward and refine through every subsequent mission. He developed a disciplined approach to patience, a willingness to spend hours maneuvering into an optimal firing position, rather than accepting a less favorable shot simply to reduce the tension of waiting. He learned to trust his sound operators' reports implicitly and to cross-reference what they heard against his own assessment of the tactical picture before committing to a course of action. He learned the particular discipline of managing his torpedo inventory carefully across a long patrol, resisting the temptation to fire at marginal opportunities when a better one might present itself with another day's patience. These were not abstract virtues. They were the practical arithmetic of survival in a campaign where ammunition, fuel, and battery charge were finite, and the ocean was very large. He also learned, on this first patrol, what it felt like to have the ocean turn against him. Every submarine commander eventually experienced the sensation of being the hunted rather than the hunter. The moment when escort vessels picked up a contact and began working toward it with their sonar equipment. When depth charges began falling close enough to throw men off their feet and shatter light bulbs and crack instrument casings. The sound of depth charges detonating at close range was described by survivors as something beyond noise, more like a physical blow delivered by the sea itself. Pipes leaked, equipment failed, men pressed themselves against whatever solid surface was nearest and waited in complete silence while the boat drifted, crew breathing as quietly as possible to reduce sound emissions, while the enemy searched above. How a commander behaved in those moments shaped everything. His crew's confidence, their ability to maintain discipline, their trust in his judgment when he ordered a maneuver that might take them toward or away from the threat. Henke's steadiness in those first, disorienting encounters with an active hunt would define the tone that ran through his boat's culture for every patrol that followed. What he brought back from this maiden voyage was something more durable than a tonnage count. He returned with a functioning understanding of the relationship between himself and his crew, how far he could push them, where the line between demanding professionalism and corrosive pressure lay, how to communicate certainty when he felt it and calm when he did not. The merchant war in the Atlantic was ultimately a human enterprise conducted inside steel cylinders, and the quality of the human relationships inside those cylinders mattered enormously to operational outcomes. Henke's natural authority, the composure that had been noted throughout his training years, translated into a command climate that was disciplined without becoming brittle. That would matter in the months ahead, when the patrols grew longer and the sea grew more hostile and the enemy overhead grew more capable. By the time U-415 returned to port from that first mission, Werner Henke had crossed a threshold that all the training in the world could only point toward, not deliver. He had commanded men in genuine danger. He had made irreversible decisions under conditions of incomplete information and live consequence. He had felt the full weight of the machine he had been given and begun to understand, not theoretically but physically, in his hands and his nerves, what it would take to operate it well. The Atlantic had presented its initial examination, as it always did, without sentiment or adjustment. Henke had passed. The ocean, indifferent as ever, was already preparing the next test. The North Atlantic in 1942 was not a place of beauty. It was a place of work, brutal, exhausting, lethal work, carried out beneath grey skies and over black water that offered no mercy to the careless and no comfort to the brave. The merchant convoys that crossed it did so because they had no choice. Britain needed fuel, food, and steel. America was pouring its industrial weight into the war effort, and the sea lanes were the arteries through which that weight flowed westward and eastward in equal measure. For the men who hunted those convoys from below, the Atlantic was both office and hunting ground, a vast and featureless workspace measured not in kilometers, but in days of silence and seconds of violence. Werner Henke had trained for this environment with the seriousness of a man who understood that preparation was the only currency that mattered out here. Now, with U-415 beneath his feet and his crew assembled around him, he was ready to spend it. His approach to hunting was not theatrical. Where some commanders cultivated a certain dramatic swagger, the inspired gambler, the instinctive predator, Henke operated more like an engineer, solving a complex problem with finite tools and shrinking margins. He studied convoy routing patterns with the same methodical attention he brought to every other aspect of his command. He tracked weather reports not for conversation but for operational advantage, understanding that a rising sea state could mask his periscope wake, that low visibility could cut Allied lookouts down to near uselessness, that the natural world could be made to work for him if he read it carefully enough. His watch officers quickly learned that he did not welcome loose speculation on the bridge. He wanted information, assessed and delivered cleanly. Guesses dressed as estimates had no place in his command culture. The early patrols of 1942 unfolded against a backdrop of considerable German success in the Atlantic. The broader U-boat campaign was still extracting a fearsome toll on Allied merchant tonnage, and the operational zone stretched from the mid-Atlantic to the American eastern seaboard, where convoy discipline had not yet hardened into the organized system it would eventually become. For a commander of Henke's temperament, this was favorable ground, not because it was easy, but because it rewarded exactly the qualities he possessed in abundance: patience, precision, and the willingness to wait for the right geometry before committing to an attack. He was not interested in heroic gestures that cost torpedoes and achieved nothing. He was interested in results that could be logged, confirmed, and built upon. His first confirmed sinkings came with a quiet efficiency that distinguished him even then from commanders who celebrated such moments as personal triumphs. For Henke, a merchant vessel going down represented the successful execution of a tactical calculation, an equation solved correctly under pressure. The emotional content of it, whatever he felt privately, was not something he permitted to color his professional conduct. Reports from his crew during these early patrols describe a commander who reacted to success with the same measured composure he brought to setbacks. An acknowledgement, a note in the log, and an immediate return of attention to the next problem. This psychological steadiness had a powerful effect on the men around him. In an environment where anxiety was the permanent background noise of daily life, a commander who did not amplify that anxiety was worth more than one who inspired brief bursts of enthusiasm. The tonnage numbers began to accumulate. Each confirmed sinking added weight to his name within the broader community of the U-boat arm, the tight and increasingly exclusive brotherhood of commanders who had taken vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. Within that community, reputations were built not on stories told in port bars, but on the cold arithmetic of the patrol log. Vessels sunk, tonnage claimed, torpedoes expended per kill. By that arithmetic, Henke was emerging as someone worth watching. He was economical with his weapons, selective in his targeting, and consistent in delivering results that the High Command found difficult to ignore. The Kriegsmarine's submarine leadership had a keen eye for commanders who produced efficiently, and Henke's name was beginning to circulate among them with the particular quality of attention that preceded formal recognition. There was, in these early months, a rhythm to his operations that his crew came to recognize and draw confidence from. He would take U-415 out to her patrol zone, establish her position with careful navigation, and then settle into the long patience of the hunt. He believed that most tactical errors were committed not from lack of skill, but from lack of discipline. Commanders who grew restless in the silence and made moves before the conditions justified them. Henke refused that temptation with a consistency that bordered on stubbornness. He would hold his position, run silent, and wait for the intelligence that told him a convoy was within reach before committing to pursuit. When he moved with purpose. There was very little wasted motion in his operational style, and the men who served under him absorbed that discipline into their own professional conduct, whether they realized it or not. His ability to read the water around him, to interpret the sounds feeding through the hydrophone, to assess the threat picture from periscope depth without exposing the boat unnecessarily, was noted by multiple crew members in later accounts. He had an almost architectural sense of the three-dimensional space around the submarine, where the escorts were, where they were likely to move, what angle of approach gave him the best shot, while keeping the greatest distance between his hull and their depth charges. These were not instincts in any mystical sense. They were the product of rigorous training applied with intelligence and refined through experience. He made difficult things look methodical and methodical things look effortless, which is perhaps the most useful illusion a commander can project in a confined steel cylinder beneath the sea. The convoys he hunted in these early patrols were not undefended. The notion that the mid-Atlantic in 1942 was simply open water for German submariners to exploit at will is a simplification that does no credit to the merchant sailors and escort crews who faced extraordinary danger to keep those supply lines open. The escorts that accompanied the convoys, destroyers, corvettes, frigates in various states of readiness, represented real threat. A single mistake in positioning, a moment of impatience that brought U-415 too close to an alert escort, could end not just the patrol but the entire crew. Henke understood this with the clarity of someone who had studied the loss reports of other boats and drawn the correct conclusions. Respect for the enemy's capability was not defeatism, it was professionalism. He ran his boat accordingly. What made him stand out, in these months of accumulating success, was not any single spectacular attack, but the cumulative weight of sustained, careful performance. He was not the kind of commander who gambled heavily on a single patrol and returned with an enormous claimed tonnage. He was the kind of commander who went out, executed his mission within acceptable risk parameters, brought his boat and his crew back in functional condition, and repeated the process with the same quiet intensity. In a campaign that was consuming U-boat commanders at a rate that appalled even those managing the war from the comfort of naval headquarters, this kind of durability was itself a form of excellence. Henke was building something, a record, a reputation, a professional identity, with the patience of a craftsman rather than the ambition of a showman. Word of his early confirmed sinkings reached the flotilla with the ordinary bureaucratic efficiency of military reporting, but the texture of the assessments that accompanied those reports was anything but ordinary. His commanding officers noted not just the results but the manner in which they were achieved, the economical use of torpedoes, the avoid-play of unnecessary risk, the clear-eyed tactical reasoning that ran through his after-action accounts. These were qualities that the Kriegsmarine's U-boat leadership had trained their commanders to aspire to, and frequently found absent in practice. In Henke, they found a commander who had absorbed those values genuinely, rather than merely understanding them as performance. His reputation, as it formed in these early months, was built on the right foundations. Among his fellow commanders, the assessment was perhaps more direct and more telling. In the cramped social world of the U-boat arm, where men who competed with each other in peacetime now competed for survival in war, Henke was regarded with a particular kind of respect. Not the admiration given to the reckless and the lucky, but the harder acknowledgement given to the competent and the consistent. He was the man you wanted beside you in a difficult operational zone, not because he would attempt the impossible, but because he would manage the possible with a precision that stretched its boundaries without breaking them. That distinction mattered enormously in a campaign where the boundary between the possible and the fatal was measured in seconds and meters. By the close of his earliest operational patrols, Werner Henke had established himself as something the Atlantic War produced only rarely, a submarine commander who combined tactical intelligence with emotional discipline in proportions that fed and reinforced each other. He was not yet the decorated figure he would become. He was not yet the subject of official recognition or public profile. He was simply a man doing a dangerous job with uncommon care, in the grey and lightless spaces where the war was being decided one hull at a time. The sea beneath him had given up vessels to his calculations, and the sea had not yet taken anything back. That arithmetic, for the moment, ran in his favour. He understood, with the same clarity that governed everything else about his approach, that it would not always do so. He continued anyway, because continuity was its own form of courage, quiet, invisible, and entirely necessary. By the time 1943 arrived, Werner Henke had shed the cautious instincts of a newcomer and stepped fully into the identity that would define his reputation. The Atlantic was no longer an unknown body of water to him. It was a system, a set of pressures and patterns, of predictable allied behaviors and exploitable gaps, of weather rhythms and sea states that could either shield a submarine or condemn it. Henke had spent the better part of a year absorbing those lessons one patrol at a time, and now he moved through that knowledge with the quiet confidence of a man who had stopped fearing what he did not understand and started using it. His crew felt the change too. There is something unmistakable about the atmosphere aboard a submarine when the commander knows what he is doing. A steadiness that travels through the hull itself, calming the men at their posts, reducing the flinch before the hydrophone report, the unnecessary noise, the hesitation. Henke's boat had that quality now, and it showed in everything from the efficiency of their dive times to the discipline of their silence when a destroyer passed overhead. The early months of that year tested every U-boat crew in the North Atlantic with a ferocity that had not been seen before. Allied convoy escort groups were growing in both size and competence. The number of dedicated anti-submarine vessels accompanying each convoy had expanded steadily, and their commanders were no longer amateurs learning on the job. They were men who had survived the early chaos of the war at sea and drawn the same kind of hard tactical intelligence from it that Henke had drawn from his own experiences. The result was a contest between two bodies of accumulated knowledge, played out across thousands of square kilometers of grey ocean, with no audience and no quarter. Henke understood this dynamic clearly. He did not dismiss his opponents. He studied them. He noted the timing of their search patterns, the radius of their sweeps, the intervals at which they deployed their depth charges, and he used that understanding to shape every approach he made against a target. One of Henke's most consistent advantages in this period was his relationship with weather, where many commanders treated bad conditions as an obstacle. Reduced visibility, violent swells, compromised hydrophone performance. Henke increasingly treated them as cover. A deteriorating North Atlantic storm front was not a reason to hold position or alter course toward calmer water. It was an opportunity. Convoy commodores were forced to reduce speed in heavy seas. Their escort vessels struggled to maintain station, and the chop that battered the escorts' hulls also degraded their sonar and radar performance in ways that briefly leveled the playing field. Henke had developed an instinct for reading the leading edge of weather systems, positioning his boat in the path of an oncoming front and timing his attack for the window when conditions were worst for the surface vessels and marginally more tolerable for a submerged boat. It was a narrow margin, and it required both nerve and precise judgment, but Henke had both in sufficient quantity to exploit it repeatedly. His approach to convoy attacks during this period reflected a maturity that went beyond simple aggression. Less experienced commanders sometimes pressed their attacks with a directness that the Allied escorts were beginning to anticipate and counter. Henke was more patient. He was willing to shadow a convoy for an extended period, sometimes more than a day, adjusting his position, observing the escort configuration, identifying the ship that sat deepest in the water and therefore likely carried the heaviest cargo. He had developed a habit of studying the silhouettes of his targets with genuine analytical care, cross-referencing what he observed through the periscope against his mental catalogue of Allied vessel types. This methodical approach sometimes cost him a quicker opportunity, but it consistently delivered higher value results and reduced the risk of a rushed attack that left him exposed inside the escort screen. His crew's training had reached a level during this period that Henke could genuinely rely on rather than merely manage. The mechanics who kept U-415 operational in the grinding conditions of sustained North Atlantic patrols were not performing well because someone was watching them. They were performing well because Henke had spent months building a standard of competence and mutual expectation aboard the boat. He was not a sentimental commander in any theatrical sense. He did not make speeches or cultivate a persona of inspirational warmth. What he offered instead was consistency, clear expectations, precise feedback, and the knowledge that any man who did his job correctly would not be second-guessed or undermined. That kind of leadership is often less visible than the heroic variety, but in the confined world of a submarine on an extended war patrol, it was worth considerably more. The depth charge remained the constant shadow over every patrol. There is no experience in conventional warfare that quite matches what it feels like to be inside a steel cylinder, perhaps 40 meters underwater, while patterns of high explosive are detonated above and around you. The concussive force travels through the water, and through the hull and through the bones of every man aboard, and the intervals between detonations carry a particular quality of dread that no amount of experience fully normalizes. Henke had lived through enough such attacks to know that the men who survived them best were not the ones who suppressed their fear by pretending it was not there. They were the ones who channeled it into function, who heard a depth charge and translated that fear immediately into the next required action. He modeled that himself and expected it from every man under his command. By the middle of 1943, the calculus of the Atlantic War had shifted in ways that no individual skill could fully counterbalance. Allied air coverage was extending further and further into what had once been the mid-Atlantic Gap, that band of ocean where shore-based aircraft from neither Britain nor North America could reach, and where U-boats had once operated with something approaching freedom. Very long-range patrol aircraft were beginning to close that gap, their radar sets capable of detecting a submarine on the surface at distances that left almost no reaction time. Henke was acutely aware of this development. His patrols required increasingly careful surface time management. The hours needed to recharge batteries had to be calculated against the risk that any extended time on the surface in a known convoy corridor was now a genuine gamble against an aircraft encounter. His response to this pressure demonstrated something important about how Henke operated under constraint. Where the strategic situation grew worse, he did not respond with recklessness or with paralysis. He adapted methodically. He adjusted the timing of his surfacing to the hours of lowest visibility and greatest sea state turbulence. He refined his emergency dive procedures until the interval between aircraft sighting and full submersion was as short as his crew could physically achieve. He rotated his lookouts more frequently on overnight surface transits, understanding that fatigue degraded the human visual system in ways that no amount of professional discipline could fully overcome. These were not dramatic innovations. They were incremental refinements of practice, each one adding a marginal increment of survivability to patrols that had become steadily more dangerous. The accumulation of those small advantages across multiple patrols throughout 1943 produced a record that distinguished Henke from the majority of his contemporaries. His kill count continued to climb at a time when many U-boat commanders were returning from patrols with nothing confirmed, and some were not returning at all. The figures that filtered back through the Kriegsmarine's operational command reflected a commander who was somehow threading the narrowing gap between Allied capability and German submarine survivability with a consistency that attracted genuine attention. Recognition was coming, formal recognition, the kind that traveled with ceremony and decoration. But Henke himself seemed less interested in what the victories signified symbolically than in the operational problem each patrol presented. He was, above all, a practitioner. What his fellow commanders observed about Henke in this period was a quality of controlled detachment that some found difficult to read. He was not distant in the cold sense of an officer who has withdrawn from human contact behind the wall of rank. He was engaged with his crew and with his mission. But there was something in the way he approached each patrol, a kind of clinical interest in the problem of survival and success, that suggested a man who had separated himself from the outcomes in some fundamental way. He did not celebrate the sinkings with the visible relief that overtook many commanders after a successful attack. He processed the result, assessed what had worked and what had not, and began thinking about the next position. Whether this was temperament or discipline or something born from the relentless pressure of extended war service is impossible to say with certainty. What it produced, operationally, was a commander of uncommon steadiness. The patrols of 1943 also revealed something about the U-boat war. that Henke almost surely recognized, even if he never articulated it in terms that found their way into any surviving record. The era of relatively straightforward merchant hunting was ending. The Atlantic, that had allowed skilled commanders to operate with significant tactical freedom in the earlier years of the war, was becoming a different body of water, monitored, contested, and increasingly hostile from the surface to several hundred meters below it. Every patrol was costing the broader U-boat fleet more than the previous one in boats lost, crews killed, and operational momentum surrendered. The Allies were not simply defending their shipping more effectively, they were actively hunting the hunters. The asymmetry of the earlier period had reversed itself, and no amount of individual tactical brilliance could fully compensate for that structural shift. And yet Henke continued. He took U-415 back out again and again, through a year that consumed more German submarines than any other period of the war. He found targets where others found only escort screens. He brought his boat home when others did not. The methods he had built across months of continuous operational pressure, the patient positioning, the weather exploitation, the refined emergency drills, the cultivated crew discipline, were keeping him alive in conditions that were killing men around him at a rate that should, statistically, have claimed him too. There was skill in this, undoubtedly, and there was experience, and there was the particular quality of judgment that comes only from having made enough correct decisions under pressure to trust your own instincts when certainty is unavailable. But there was also, running quietly beneath all of it, the unpredictable element that shapes every life in wartime, the particular arrangement of circumstances that spares one man and not another, and that no amount of skill can fully account for. By the middle of 1943, Werner Henke had crossed a threshold that very few men in the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm would ever reach. The kill count mounted quietly in the ledgers of U-boat command. Each confirmed sinking a notation in a logbook, a ship name struck from an Allied manifest somewhere across the water. 10 vessels, 10 separate moments when a torpedo had found its mark, when the calculations of angle, speed, and distance had resolved into smoke and fire on the surface of the Atlantic. That number carried weight in a world where most U-boat commanders never sank a single ship before their own boat was sent to the bottom. Henke had done it methodically, patrol by patrol, without the reckless aggression that destroyed lesser commanders, and without the timidity that left others returning to port with full torpedo racks and empty logs. He had found a rhythm in the ocean, and the ocean, for a time, had rewarded him. The recognition that followed was not merely ceremonial. Promotion to Kapitänleutnant came with the practical authority to take greater operational latitude, to argue for specific patrol zones, to be consulted rather than simply instructed. Within the culture of the U-boat arm, rank mattered less than reputation, and Henke's reputation had become a currency of its own. Senior officers at Lorient and Brest spoke of him as a commander who thought clearly under pressure, who did not allow the isolation of weeks beneath the surface to erode his judgment. Crew morale aboard his boat remained high, not because he was warm or familiar, but because the men believed their captain would bring them home. That belief, in the claustrophobic interior of a Type 7 or 9 submarine, was the most valuable thing a commander could offer. The Kriegsmarine made use of its aces carefully, understanding that their value extended beyond any single patrol. Henke's name began to appear in the controlled channels of German naval communication as an example of what discipline and training could produce. He was not the most famous name in the U-boat fleet. That territory belonged to others whose tonnage counts had already entered into propaganda. But among the men who understood the technical demands of submarine warfare, His name carried genuine weight. He had achieved his results not in the early, easier months when Allied defenses were thin and convoys sailed with minimal escorts, but as the war at sea had already begun to grow more complex and unforgiving. That context made the numbers mean more. Yet even as Henke's personal record solidified, the broader picture was beginning to shift in ways that no individual achievement could reverse. The Atlantic in the middle period of 1943 was not the same ocean it had been when the U-boat arm had terrorized Allied shipping in those brutal early years. The gap in air coverage that had once allowed submarines to operate on the surface for extended periods, recharging batteries and maneuvering into attack positions, was closing. Long-range patrol aircraft were reaching further out from both the British Isles and the American eastern seaboard, their radar capable of detecting a surfaced U-boat at distances that gave a crew almost no time to react. The ocean that had once felt like operational freedom was becoming a killing ground. Allied convoy organization had also matured in ways that made Henke's methods harder to apply. The routing of convoys had become more sophisticated, with intelligence assets on the Allied side providing information that allowed merchant groups to be steered around known U-boat patrol areas. Escort vessel numbers had increased, and the quality of anti-submarine training aboard those ships had improved steadily. A destroyer captain in 1943 was a different opponent from the same rank 2 years earlier. He knew the hydrophone, knew the depth charge pattern, understood how to coordinate with aircraft overhead to press a contact until either the submarine was destroyed or its crew was forced to make a fatal error. The whole weight of Allied industrial capacity and organizational intelligence was bearing down on the U-boat force, and no degree of individual brilliance could stop that tide from coming in. The German submarine command, under Karl Dönitz, recognized the crisis intellectually, even as it struggled to accept it operationally. The loss rates among U-boats had climbed to figures that, if discussed openly, would have been devastating to morale. Entire crews who had trained together, who had passed through the same academies and shared the same mess tables, were simply gone. Boats that dived and never came back up, or that were caught on the surface by aircraft before the crew could even reach the hatches. Henke was aware of these losses. Every commander who returned to a French Atlantic port knew the empty berths where other boats had once been moored, knew the names that no longer appeared on the duty rosters. The arithmetic of attrition was not something that could be ignored. And yet the patrols continued. The mission did not change because the odds had worsened. Henke prepared for each departure with the same structured attention to his boat's systems, his crew's readiness, his charts, and his fuel calculations. There was a kind of professional stubbornness in this that was common among the best commanders, not an inability to perceive danger, but a refusal to allow perceived danger to compromise the standards of preparation and execution. A boat that left port with its captain already defeated in his mind was a boat that would not come home. Henke carried the weight of the strategic reality and set it aside during the practical work of command. The two things had to be kept separate. His tactical approach in this period showed the adaptation of a commander who was learning from a changing environment rather than simply repeating what had worked before. Surface attacks at night, which had once been the preferred method of the most aggressive U-boat commanders, had become far riskier as radar-equipped aircraft began to patrol the darkness as effectively as the daylight hours. Henke adjusted, leaning more heavily on submerged approaches, accepting the limitations of periscope depth firing solutions in exchange for the protection that depth provided. The calculations became more demanding, the margins for error tighter, the torpedo expenditure per sinking higher than it had been in more permissive conditions. It took more of everything to achieve the same result. His crew, tested by multiple patrols and shaped by Henke's exacting standards, had become a functioning unit of considerable quality. The relationship between a U-boat commander and his crew was unlike almost any other in military service. Proximity enforced an intimacy that conventional military hierarchy usually prevented. In the compressed interior of a submarine, the captain and the most junior rating shared the same recycled air, heard the same sounds, felt the same pressure changes as depth charges detonated at what everyone hoped was a safe distance. The pretense of distance that hierarchy created in other environments simply could not be sustained. Henke managed this by maintaining absolute clarity about his expectations without reducing his authority to mere proximity and familiarity. The men knew what he required, and they delivered it. The formal recognition of his 10th confirmed sinking placed Henke in a category that German naval command was careful to cultivate and display. Successful U-boat commanders were proof that the war at sea could still be fought effectively, that the investment in submarine construction and training was producing results. The propaganda apparatus surrounding the U-boat arm was sophisticated and pervasive, and the names of its aces appeared in publications, in newsreel footage shot at portside ceremonies, in radio broadcasts directed at a German civilian population that was beginning to sense, even through the censored news, that the war was not going as smoothly as the official accounts suggested. Henke occupied a genuine position in this landscape, not an invented one. His record was real, his promotions earned, but the purpose his name served extended beyond the purely military. There was a particular irony visible, in retrospect to any observer of this period. The very moment at which Henke's career reached its highest formal recognition was also the moment at which the conditions that had made such a career possible were most rapidly disappearing. The same weeks that saw his promotion and the acknowledgement of his kill count were weeks in which other U-boat commanders were being destroyed in record numbers, when Allied planners were examining intelligence on the precise locations of German submarine patrol areas, when escort carrier groups were being assembled specifically to hunt the kind of boat Henke commanded. The award ceremony and the funeral for a lost crew were separated by the thinnest of operational margins, and every man who pinned on a new rank badge in a French port city understood that reality at some level, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. What defined Henke in this period, and what would carry him through what was to come, was not the number of ships sunk or the decorations worn, but something harder to name and more essential to the work. It was the capacity to continue functioning with clarity when the environment was designed to produce confusion and defeat, to maintain the habits of a disciplined officer when the larger picture offered little encouragement. The ocean did not care about promotion or recognition. The convoy did not yield to reputation. Every patrol was its own argument with the sea, its own contest of preparation against circumstance, and Henke understood this in a way that the most celebrated names in the U-boat arm sometimes did not. The score was real. The conditions that had produced it were changing. The next patrol would require everything the previous ones had, and offer nothing additional in return. By the middle of 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become something altogether different from the hunting ground Werner Henke had learned to master. The waters he had once patrolled with calculated confidence now bristled with a coordinated machinery of destruction designed specifically to extinguish boats like his. The Allies had transformed their convoy defense strategy through sheer accumulated resources and technological innovation. Long-range aircraft now flew escort missions that extended hundreds of kilometers from the coasts of Britain and North Africa. Radar installations aboard frigates and corvettes could detect a submarine's conning tower at distances that made traditional attack approaches nearly suicidal. The U-boat force, which had spent the early war years operating in an almost uncontested domain, now found itself hunted with industrial precision. Henke and his fellow commanders understood that the fundamental conditions of submarine warfare had shifted beneath them, even as they continued to receive orders demanding results. The operational geography changed first. In the early stages of his command, Henke had ranged across relatively well-mapped hunting zones where merchant traffic followed predictable patterns and Allied defenses were scattered and inconsistent. By 1943, these comfortable waters became crowded with threats. Convoys sailing from Halifax to Liverpool now travelled under continuous air cover during daylight hours, with additional protection from upgraded escort groups that included fast destroyers and specialized anti-submarine vessels. The Germans had believed that sheer numbers of U-boats, acting in coordinated wolf packs, could overwhelm these defenses through attrition and concentrated assault. That theory had worked, to some extent, in 1942, but the Allies possessed the capacity to build destroyer escorts faster than the Germans could build submarines, and they possessed something more intangible but equally decisive: the ability to learn from each engagement and adapt their tactics accordingly. Henke's patrols now took him farther south and farther east, into waters where escort ships had begun to operate with new proficiency. The human cost among the U-boat fleet reached catastrophic proportions during this period, and Henke was acutely aware of it. The loss rate among German submarines climbed steadily through 1943, with entire flotillas suffering devastation in single convoy engagements. Commanders whom Henke had trained with, officers he respected for their technical skill and tactical imagination, simply did not return from patrol. The memorials grew longer in the submarine bases at Brest and Saint-Nazaire. Messages arrived periodically announcing the loss of boats, with numbers that had once seemed like abstractions but now represented specific men, specific crews, specific capabilities subtracted from the fleet. The psychological weight of these accumulating losses pressed on every officer who remained in command. Henke maintained his professional demeanor, but the mathematics of attrition could not be ignored by anyone with basic arithmetic skills. His own narrow escapes during patrols in 1943 began to feel less like the result of superior seamanship and more like the arbitrary mercy of chance. One particular engagement in the spring of 1943 illustrated both Henke's technical proficiency and the growing danger of the operational environment. His boat detected a convoy through careful hydrophone work and positioned itself ahead of the merchant vessels to execute what should have been a straightforward attack. The convoy's escort screen was relatively small, suggesting an opportunity for the kind of surface attack that had produced results in previous years. Henke brought his boat to the surface during twilight hours, a calculated risk that allowed his gunnery crews to function more effectively than they could underwater. The initial attack succeeded, and flames erupted from at least one merchant vessel as shells struck home. But within minutes, the escort vessels responded with a speed and coordination that revealed how thoroughly their training had evolved. Henke ordered an immediate dive, and the boat responded to his commands with the mechanical perfection that was his hallmark as a commander. What followed was a depth charge attack that lasted for hours, with the escort ships maintaining contact and launching patterns of explosive charges that shook the entire vessel and cracked instruments on their mounts. Henke executed evasive maneuvers with careful precision, using his knowledge of water temperature layers and bottom topography to mask his boat's acoustic signature. The U-boat escaped, damaged but functional, limping away from the convoy at reduced speed and returning to base after a transit that felt like an ordeal of attrition against time itself. The technological escalation became relentless, and in some ways, more menacing than conventional weapons. Allied radar had become the primary threat in Henke's assessment. A U-boat surfaced at night to recharge its batteries and refresh the air inside the hull, making it vulnerable to radar detection if an aircraft happened to be transiting the area. The introduction of centimetric radar aboard escort vessels meant that a submarine could be spotted at ranges that allowed no time for a proper dive. This forced German submarines to operate submerged for longer periods, which increased crew fatigue and reduced battery capacity for the sustained underwater maneuvers that successful attacks required. Henke and other experienced commanders began requesting additional equipment to counter this threat. The Metox radar detector, when it finally arrived, provided some warning of radar emissions in the frequency ranges the Allies were then employing. But the Allies simply changed their frequencies, and the technological game became one of perpetual disadvantage for the submarines. New snorkel technology allowed a boat to run its diesel engines while submerged, breathing through a tube that extended above the water. This promised revolutionary improvements in underwater endurance, but the early versions were unreliable and temperamental. Henke participated in trials of the snorkel system, understanding its potential, but also recognizing the persistent problems that could kill a crew if equipment failed at the wrong moment during a dive. The weather patterns of the Atlantic became another adversary that Henke studied with intense focus. Storm systems that swept across the ocean in the autumn and winter months could damage a surface vessel or a submarine with equal indifference, but they also represented opportunities that a skilled commander could exploit. Heavy weather degraded the effectiveness of both radar and visual detection. Aircraft could not patrol effectively in severe conditions. Henke learned to read meteorological reports with the care of a navigator reading charts, using approaching weather systems to mask his boat's movements and position himself for attacks that would otherwise be impossible. The paradox was that these same storms created conditions of extreme physical hardship for his crew. The motion of the boat made sleep nearly impossible, and made every movement through narrow corridors and down vertical ladders a negotiation with gravity and inertia. The air inside the boat became thick with moisture, and the accumulated odor of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and cooking. Men developed infections and rashes that had no remedy aboard a submarine. These hardships were not unique to Henke's boat, but he was aware of them in a way that distinguished him from other commanders who seemed to regard crew welfare as subordinate to operational achievement. By mid-1943, the question that occupied the minds of thinking officers was not whether individual submarines could still achieve tactical victories, but whether the U-boat campaign itself had become strategically irrelevant. The Allies were building merchant ships faster than German submarines could sink them. The convoy system, despite its costs, was functioning well enough to maintain supplies for Britain and preparation for the invasion of occupied Europe that was clearly coming. German intelligence reported on the immense scale of American industrial capacity, the hundreds of thousands of troops assembling in Britain, the technical sophistication of Allied weapons systems that seemed to improve with each passing month. Henke did not share these doubts openly with his crew, as that would have been disastrous for morale and discipline. But in conversations with other commanders during periods of leave, he acknowledged what the numbers suggested. The victory that the U-boat force had been promised, the strangling of Britain through starvation, and the prevention of American intervention had become a fantasy that bore no relationship to the military situation. Yet the orders continued to arrive, directing submarines to patrol, to hunt, to inflict damage on the enemy. It was a form of mechanical persistence, the continuation of a campaign that everyone involved could see was failing. The human relationships within Henke's crew began to show the strain of this impossible situation. Submariners had always been volunteers, a fact that was emphasized repeatedly during recruitment and training. Unlike surface naval officers who might find themselves assigned to a ship almost by administrative chance, U-boat crewmen knew explicitly that they were embracing danger and embracing a particular kind of warfare that had no margin for error or recovery. The first patrols produced a kind of exhilaration despite the danger, as crews worked through their initial anxieties and began to understand their boat as an extension of their collective will. But by 1943, the exhilaration had been replaced by a grinding dread. Men who had survived multiple patrols knew the statistics well enough. The odds of surviving the war in a U-boat were among the worst of any military service. Henke observed his crew carefully during this period, noting which men had begun to show signs of psychological breakdown, which men drank too heavily during brief periods of shore leave, which men seemed to have made an internal peace with their likely fate. He rotated personnel when possible, sending men who had completed multiple patrols to shore positions or to training duties, bringing in younger sailors who still possessed some remnants of the naive confidence that made submarine operations function. It was a delicate balance between maintaining crew cohesion and acknowledging realities that could not be spoken aloud without corroding the discipline that kept the boat functioning as an effective weapon. Henke's reputation among his crew was built on this kind of careful management of reality. He was not a charismatic commander who inspired through rhetoric or through the force of his personality. He was, rather, a technically proficient officer who made decisions that kept his boat operational and its crew alive through patrols that other submarines were not surviving. His crew respected him because they understood, with the clarity that comes from intimate proximity to death, that their commander possessed the skills and judgment necessary for their survival. This respect manifested in a particular kind of obedience that was not born from fear or ideology, but from confidence. Henke's orders during maneuvers were executed with precision because the crew understood that each command had been thought through carefully and reflected tactical reality. His caution in some situations and his aggression in others came from the same source of judgment, making him predictable in the most functional sense. The crew of U-boat 415 knew that whatever happened in the Atlantic, their commander would do everything within his power to bring them home. This was not patriotism, though some of them were patriots. It was the bond that forms between men who face existential risk, together under the command of someone who takes that responsibility seriously. Henke's narrow escapes from destruction became more frequent during 1943, and each one left its mark on the fabric of the boat itself and on the psychology of the crew. A close encounter with a destroyer that Henke evaded through a series of maneuvers that exploited the acoustic dead zone created by the destroyer's own wake left the submarine with hull damage that took weeks to repair. Another patrol brought the boat into contact with an aircraft that dropped depth charges with terrifying accuracy, forcing Henke to execute an emergency crash dive that damaged trim systems and filled the forward torpedo room with seawater before the flooding could be contained. These incidents were survivable, and Henke's technical skill ensured that they remained survivable rather than becoming catastrophic, but they accumulated. Each time the boat was damaged, repairs consumed resources and time. Each time the crew experienced a moment of genuine mortal terror, it increased the psychological attrition that no amount of rest in port could fully repair. The boat itself began to acquire the character of a vessel that had been through a prolonged ordeal. The interior smelled of salt water and mildew, even when everything had been thoroughly cleaned. Visible patches marked where hull damage had been repaired. Equipment that had been knocked from its mounts and hastily remounted functioned adequately, but never quite as originally designed. The boat became, in a certain sense, a physical manifestation of the declining prospects of the U-boat fleet itself. The strategic picture was becoming clearer to officers like Henke as 1943 progressed toward 1944. The invasion of Sicily by Allied forces in the summer of 1943 demonstrated that the Allies could conduct amphibious operations at a scale that Germany could not match. The Italian surrender that followed eliminated Germany's only significant ally in the Mediterranean. In the Atlantic, the establishment of air bases in the Azores meant that the mid-ocean air gap, where submarines had operated with relative freedom, was beginning to close. The Germans experimented with new weapons systems, including acoustic homing torpedoes designed to attack escort vessels. But these innovations produced no fundamental alteration in the equation. Henke received orders for new operational zones, areas farther east where escort defenses might be less established or where different tactical approaches might yield results. These patrols took him into colder waters off the coast of Iceland and toward the ice edge where polar conditions created additional hazards but also offered opportunities for concealment. The operational patterns that had defined his earlier successes became increasingly difficult to execute. The methodical positioning before an attack, the careful approach to a convoy, the calculation of angles and distances based on acoustic bearings, these remained Henke's strengths. But the operational environment had evolved in ways that rendered these traditional tactics progressively less effective. Henke's status as an experienced and successful commander meant that he was consulted about tactics and technical matters that affected the wider U-boat force. He participated in briefings with staff officers from the submarine command structure, contributing his observations about changing Allied tactics and the equipment that might help counter them. These briefings revealed that the strategic situation was understood as dire by officers at higher levels, even if this understanding was not always reflected in the orders that submarines continued to receive. There were discussions of new types of boats, revolutionary designs that would theoretically restore German submarine superiority through speed or depth capabilities. There were proposals for submarine-based weapons systems of extraordinary complexity that would take years to develop. There were strategic concepts involving coordinated operations with surface raiders or with aircraft that bore no relationship to any realistic assessment of German air power. Henke listened to these discussions with the practiced patience of a professional soldier, understanding that they represented a form of institutional denial rather than genuine planning. The U-boat force as it then existed would fight the remainder of the war with the boats that were already in operation. New designs would contribute nothing to the battles of the next year or 18 months. The war would be decided by factors that submarines could not influence. By the end of 1943, Henke had survived more than 20 major engagements with Allied escort forces, including several that had brought his boat to the threshold of destruction. His confirmed kill count had stabilized at the level that had earned him recognition and promotion, but the tactical environment no longer permitted the kind of sustained operational success that had characterized his earlier years in command. The waters that had once seemed manageable, however dangerous, had become hostile in a more comprehensive sense. The entire ocean had been transformed into a coordinated arena of Allied military. By the middle of 1943, Werner Henke had become something more than a submarine commander. He had become a statistic that mattered, a number that could be counted and celebrated in the carefully managed press apparatus of Nazi Germany. His confirmed kill count had climbed past 10 vessels, Some of those ships carried vital cargo across the Atlantic: grain, ammunition, steel, the sinews of British survival. Others were simply there, in the wrong place at the wrong moment, part of the vast commercial machinery that kept the Allied war effort breathing. The arithmetic of sinkings was straightforward and uncomplicated, a form of measurement that required no nuance, no judgment of moral weight. By the standards that mattered in Berlin, Henke had proven himself worthy of recognition. The machinery of military honor in Nazi Germany operated with well-oiled precision. The award system was sophisticated and hierarchical, designed to motivate excellence, reward loyalty, and most crucially, provide the German population with heroes to admire in a war that was growing increasingly difficult to defend on rational grounds. The U-boat arm had always occupied a special place in this calculation. Submariners were perceived as elite warriors, men who operated in extreme conditions, whose courage was unquestionable, whose sacrifice was visible. They sank enemy ships and damaged enemy economies. They did not retreat or surrender. They descended into the darkness and emerged victorious or perished in the attempt. This narrative was powerful, emotionally resonant, and almost entirely removed from the grinding reality of mechanical failure, bad weather, and the simple mathematics of being hunted by opponents who were learning faster than the Germans could adapt. The Iron Cross, in its various grades, represented the pinnacle of recognition within the German military hierarchy. The second-class Iron Cross was more common, distributed with greater frequency to officers and men who demonstrated competence and commitment. But the first-class Iron Cross was something different. It signified not merely competence but distinction, a separation from the ordinary ranks of capable military officers into a category reserved for the genuinely exceptional. For a submarine captain, earning the Iron Cross First Class represented a kind of apotheosis. It meant that one's record was undeniable, that one's achievements had been validated by the high command, that one had earned the respect not merely of one's peers, but of the institutional military apparatus itself. Henke's award came, as such things often do, at a moment when the broader situation demanded a morale boost. The year 1943 had been catastrophic for the U-boat fleet. The introduction of improved Allied convoy defenses, the expansion of air cover over the Atlantic, the deployment of escort carriers specifically designed to hunt submarines, and the cracking of German naval codes had combined to create an environment in which the advantage had shifted decisively. In May of 1943, the Germans had suffered losses so severe that they had effectively abandoned the Atlantic convoy campaign. The U-boat fleet, which had seemed like a weapon capable of strangling British commerce and turning the tide of the entire war, had been forced into retreat and reorganization. The entire strategic doctrine upon which so much German hope had been invested was proving to be a chimera. In this context, Henke's medals meant something more than simple recognition of military prowess. They represented a kind of defiant assertion that despite the deteriorating situation, Germany still possessed skilled and dedicated military professionals. They suggested that if individual commanders could achieve such results, then perhaps the broader situation was not quite as dire as the pessimists claimed. They offered a narrative framework in which the U-boat war could be discussed and understood not as a strategic failure, but as a series of individual achievements by brave men doing their duty. This was the propaganda value, and it was considerable. Every U-boat commander who received high honors was not merely a recipient of recognition. He was a prop in a carefully constructed narrative meant to sustain morale on the home front and justify the continued sacrifice of resources to a submarine campaign that the High Command privately knew was failing. The ceremonies that accompanied such awards were elaborately staged affairs. They took place in Berlin or at naval bases with important symbolic value. Senior officers attended. The local press was invited. Photographs were taken and distributed to newspapers. Henke would have understood the significance of the moment. He was a professional officer who had grown up in an era when military decoration carried profound social meaning. To receive the Iron Cross First Class at his relatively young age, as a captain who had only recently achieved truly significant success, was to be marked as one of the military's rising figures. It meant access to better assignments, to greater influence in the submarine service, to the respect of senior officers, and even, to some degree, to the leadership of the nation itself. But the medals and the ceremonies and the photographs in the newspapers could not change the fundamental realities of the Atlantic. They could not turn back the clock to the months when individual U-boat commanders, operating with sufficient freedom and minimal opposition, had been able to sink Allied shipping almost at will. They could not restore the technological advantage that German submarines had once possessed. They could not eliminate the expanding networks of radar, sonar, and coordinated air and sea search that were now making every patrol a lethal game of increasingly unfavorable odds. Henke's recognition came at a moment when the conditions that had allowed such success to be achieved were rapidly disappearing. This was not his fault. It was simply the trajectory of historical events, the grinding pressure of superior Allied resources and improving Allied tactics. What the Iron Cross represented, ultimately, was an acknowledgement of what Henke had already accomplished. It did not promise future success or offer any guarantee of safety. It was a decoration for a moment, for a particular achievement in a particular time, yet it was real. It was a visible marker of excellence within a system that valued such markers profoundly. Henke's fellow officers understood its significance. The submarine community was small enough that news of major awards traveled quickly through the fleet. Being recognized by High Command meant something. It meant that one's tactics had been studied and approved. It meant that one's service record had been examined and found exceptional. It meant that the institution itself had placed its stamp of approval on one's career and abilities. The irony that would haunt this moment, though no one could have foreseen it with certainty, was the divergence between individual recognition and collective outcome. The U-boat service was being honored with medals and ceremonies and propagandistic celebration at the precise moment when it was transitioning from a threat to the Allies into a dangerous but ultimately surmountable problem. The men who commanded submarines in 1943 and beyond would perform their duties with skill and courage, many of them, but the overwhelming majority would not achieve the sustained success that Henke had already captured. The window of opportunity was closing. The Allies were no longer learning how to fight the U-boat threat. They had learned. Now they were beginning to master it. Henke's medals were decorations for a weapon system that was entering the twilight of its effective life. Yet in the moment itself, there was genuine honor in the recognition. Henke had demonstrated tactical competence and professional excellence. He had sunk ships. He had commanded a complex military machine under stress and danger. He had contributed, within the narrow confines of what a submarine commander could accomplish, to the German war effort. The fact that this war effort was ultimately going to fail, that the broader strategic and political situation made German victory increasingly impossible, did not diminish the reality of what he had achieved as a professional military officer. He had done his job with apparent skill and had been rewarded for it by his own institution and his own leadership. In any military system anywhere in the world, such recognition would carry genuine meaning. The submarines that operated in the Atlantic in 1943 were themselves becoming increasingly sophisticated machines. The technologies aboard Henke's boat and other U-boats of the later war years incorporated engineering advances and tactical innovations that reflected the constant adaptation required to survive in an environment growing more hostile by the month. The crew that served under Henke's command operated this machinery with professional competence. They performed complex technical functions under stress. They accepted the extraordinary risk that came with serving in a weapon system that was under relentless pressure from increasingly capable adversaries. In the context of a military organization, such service deserved recognition. The Iron Cross acknowledged this, both for Henke as the commanding officer, and by extension, for the entire system he represented. What could not be acknowledged in the official ceremonies and press releases was the increasingly desperate situation developing across multiple theaters of the war. The Soviet Union was grinding forward on the Eastern Front. North Africa had been lost. Sicily had fallen to Allied invasion. Italy was becoming a contested zone. The bombing campaign against German cities was intensifying. The strategic situation was deteriorating across every measurable dimension. The U-boat campaign, which had once been the primary tool through which Germany hoped to achieve a negotiated peace, or at least to defend against simultaneous Allied threats, was failing to produce the results that had been promised. Yet Henke's medals suggested otherwise. They suggested a military organization still capable of producing excellence, still achieving victories, still worthy of support and sacrifice from the German people. In a broader sense, Henke's recognition represented a kind of institutional commitment to the U-boat service, at a moment when that commitment was being tested by results that fell far short of expectation. The High Command could have acknowledged the failure, could have redirected resources away from submarines toward other branches of the military. Instead, they recognized Henke and other successful U-boat commanders and attempted to maintain the narrative of the submarine as a strategic weapon. This was not necessarily military foolishness. The U-boats, even in their diminished capacity, were still inflicting damage on Allied shipping and tying down significant Allied naval and air resources. The question was whether the investment in submarines could be justified, given the resources required and the mounting losses among U-boat crews. For the leadership in Berlin, the answer was still yes, or at least not no strongly enough to warrant stopping. The medals, the ceremonies, and the propaganda that followed represented an institutional choice to continue, to sustain morale, and to maintain the narrative. Henke's life had entered a new phase. He was no longer simply a competent U-boat commander. He was a decorated officer, recognized by his nation and by his military service as an exceptional professional. This carried privileges, respect, and a certain kind of social status. It also carried expectations. He would be watched. His future patrols would be scrutinized. His performance would be held to a higher standard because he had now been marked as an elite operator. In some ways, this recognition was the apex of his career as an active military officer. The medals would remain with him, the accomplishment would be permanent, the achievement would be undeniable. Yet even as these honors were being bestowed, the Atlantic itself was changing. The waters through which he would sail on future patrols were becoming more dangerous, more heavily defended, more densely packed with Allied forces learning how to hunt and destroy submarines with increasing efficiency. The stage upon which Henke's military drama would continue to unfold was being fundamentally altered by factors entirely beyond his control. By 1944, the Atlantic was no longer the domain of the lone hunter. The waters that had once belonged to men like Werner Henke now bristled with detection systems, aircraft equipped with powerful searchlights, and escort vessels coordinated by intelligence networks that tracked U-boat movements across thousands of kilometers. Henke understood this shift as acutely as any commander in the Kriegsmarine. The strategic mathematics had transformed. Where once a skilled submarine captain could operate for weeks with minimal harassment, now every patrol became a desperate race against technological superiority. The Allies had moved beyond simple convoy protection and into the realm of systematic elimination. They possessed tools that could detect a submerged U-boat at distances that made traditional underwater tactics obsolete. For Henke and the submarine force, this meant one inescapable reality: adapt or perish. The introduction of new equipment became not a luxury but a requirement for survival. The snorkel apparatus represented the most significant technological adaptation of this period, a breathing device that allowed a submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining submerged. Previously, U-boats had been forced to surface to recharge their batteries, a moment of extreme vulnerability when aircraft or escort vessels could spot them against the horizon. The snorkel changed this equation in fundamental ways. By drawing air through a tube that extended just above the water's surface, a submarine could remain largely hidden while maintaining operational mobility. Henke's boat received this installation during a refitting period in early 1944. The modification was not elegant or particularly comfortable for the crew, but its tactical implications were profound. The snorkel meant more time submerged, fewer exposed moments, and a marginally improved chance of evading Allied patrols. Yet the snorkel carried its own liabilities. The apparatus created a small but detectable signature on radar, a thin mast rising above the waves. Aircraft equipped with the latest detection equipment could sometimes spot this protrusion, particularly during daylight hours or when sea conditions favored visibility. More troubling for Henke and his men was the operational limitation the device imposed. A submarine running on snorkel could only maintain modest speeds and had to remain in waters relatively close to the surface. The deeper drafts where a U-boat had traditionally hidden were no longer accessible while breathing through the tube. The snorkel was evolution, yes, but constrained evolution. It was a partial answer to a problem that demanded total solutions. Henke accepted these limitations as the price of remaining operational. He had no alternatives. The older boats without snorkels were simply dying faster, caught on the surface by Allied air power, or hunted down by task forces that had grown increasingly effective at coordinated submarine warfare. Alongside the snorkel came improved hydrophone systems, the ears of the underwater world. These sensitive acoustic listening devices allowed a submarine to detect distant convoy engines, the propeller signatures of escort vessels, and even the particular sounds of different ship classes at considerable range. Henke's technical mind grasped the operational advantages immediately. Superior detection meant superior positioning. If his boat could hear enemy forces before being heard, the ancient calculus of naval warfare still favored the patient hunter. The new hydrophones were far more sophisticated than earlier models, capable of distinguishing subtle variations in machinery noise that older equipment would have treated as simple acoustic blur. A trained operator could identify a specific type of merchant vessel by sound alone, could estimate its speed and course, could calculate intercept points before visual contact became possible. For a captain like Henke, who had built his reputation on methodical tactics and careful preparation, these tools felt almost like returning to conditions he could control. The training required to employ these new systems was extensive. Henke insisted that his hydrophone operators practice constantly, developing an almost intuitive relationship with the equipment. The submarine became a classroom of sorts, with experienced men teaching newer crew members to read the ocean's subtle acoustic landscape. The process was painstaking and repetitive, but Henke understood that technology without expertise was merely expensive equipment. His men had to develop the skill to interpret what the machines told them, to separate genuine signals from false echoes, to maintain focus during long periods of listening that demanded absolute concentration. The younger crew members found the work monotonous until they began to understand that their ability to hear an approaching escort vessel 5 kilometers away might mean the difference between successfully attacking a merchant ship and having their own boat targeted for destruction. Focus transformed into sharp attention when the stakes became visceral. But equipment and training alone could not overcome the fundamental reality of the strategic situation. The Allies had achieved something unprecedented in naval history: a coordinated system of detection, communication, and response that operated across entire ocean basins. Aircraft carrier groups, long-range patrol bombers, surface escort vessels equipped with sonar, and intelligence networks that intercepted and decoded German communications all worked in concert. A single improved hydrophone system aboard a U-boat was impressive in isolation, but it was merely one voice in an increasingly crowded conversation. Henke's boat might detect a convoy, but that detection could trigger a response from multiple Allied vessels arriving within hours. The Allies were not hunting submarines one at a time anymore. They were employing systematic methods that treated U-boats as a coordinated problem requiring systematic solutions. The snorkel and improved hydrophones were like bringing a better sword to a battle where the enemy had invented the firearm. Henke witnessed the technological arms race in other ways as well. The engines aboard his submarine had been modified for marginal gains in efficiency, squeezing additional hours of operation from fuel supplies as the distance between safe harbors and operational areas increased. The torpedoes themselves had undergone refinement, with acoustically guided variants that could track the noise of ship engines. These weapons represented the cutting edge of German underwater warfare technology, yet even they were becoming less effective as Allied escort vessels deployed countermeasures and acoustic decoys. Every German advancement seemed to prompt a faster Allied response. It was an exhausting dynamic for commanders like Henke, who understood the technical dimensions of submarine warfare. The innovation pipeline that had once favored Germany had reversed. Now the Allies brought new capabilities to the Atlantic with alarming frequency, each iteration making the submarine's tactical situation more difficult. The psychological weight of this technological competition affected Henke in ways he could not fully articulate to his crew. He maintained his composed demeanor, his meticulous approach to operations, his careful analysis of every patrol. But beneath this professional exterior lay an awareness that no amount of equipment modification could overcome the Allies' fundamental advantages. More men in the U-boat fleet were beginning to grasp this grim mathematics. Conversations in the barracks and ready rooms of submarine bases carried a resignation that had not been present in earlier years. The older veterans could remember when U-boats had seemed invincible, when the technological advantage had belonged to Germany. Now that world had inverted. The newest equipment was no longer sufficient. It was merely necessary for survival, a prerequisite for extended operations rather than a tool for achieving victory. Despite these sobering realities, Henke continued to embrace every technological innovation available to him. His boat became a floating example of German submarine engineering at its most advanced. The snorkel system was meticulously maintained by crew members who understood that malfunction meant returning to the surface and accepting the dangers that entailed. The hydrophone operators were among the finest in the U-boat fleet, men trained relentlessly to extract maximum information from the acoustic environment. The torpedo systems were maintained with obsessive care. Every piece of equipment functioned as intended because Henke demanded nothing less. This was not merely military discipline, but a direct translation of his tactical philosophy. Technology had become the intermediate ground between intention and outcome, and Henke controlled that ground as precisely as he could. The constant need for adaptation, however, carried another message that Henke could not ignore. The German submarine program was becoming reactive rather than proactive. Once, U-boats had innovations that allowed them to dominate. Now they were scrambling to match Allied capabilities while falling further behind in overall numbers and industrial capacity. The snorkel and improved hydrophones were responses to problems that should never have arisen. They were technological patches applied to a strategic wound that could not be healed through engineering alone. Henke was astute enough to recognize this distinction, even if he could not openly acknowledge it to his superiors. The war on the Atlantic had fundamentally shifted character. It was no longer a contest between hunters, but rather a struggle by an endangered species to survive against an overwhelming environmental change. By the spring of 1944, when Henke prepared for what would be his final patrol, his submarine represented the absolute pinnacle of German U-boat technology. Every system had been upgraded. Every crew member had been trained intensively. The boat was as close to perfect as mechanical creation could achieve, and yet Henke knew that none of this mattered if the Allies maintained their coordination, their numerical superiority, and their commitment to hunting submarines to extinction. The technology was impressive, the crew was exceptional, but the larger context had become impossible. He would take his boat to sea one more time with the latest equipment, the best training, and the hardened experience of multiple patrols. The tools were in place. What remained was to see whether even the finest tools could overcome the verdict that history was rendering across the Atlantic. The year was 1944. Across the Atlantic, winter gave way to spring, and with it came a cruel mathematics that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could alter. Werner Henke, now a seasoned Kapitänleutnant with over a dozen enemy vessels credited to his name, stood in the conning tower of U-boat 415 and confronted a reality that had been forming like ice in the dark water around him for months. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine, once the terror of Allied shipping lanes, was no longer hunting. It was being hunted. The hunters had become the hunted, and the margin between survival and oblivion had narrowed to a knife's edge that grew sharper with each passing week. When Henke had first taken command of 415 in 1942, the Atlantic had belonged to Germany. A skilled commander with the right tactics, the right timing, and reasonable fortune could find a convoy, maneuver into position, and deliver tonnage to the depths with a regularity that almost resembled routine. The sea was vast, the ocean was deep, and the submarine's greatest advantage lay in invisibility. But invisibility, as Henke would learn, was a shrinking commodity. By early 1944, the Allies had woven a net so dense, so layered with detection systems and coordinated responses, that a U-boat's greatest enemy was no longer a single destroyer or a brave merchant vessel captain making a desperate run. The enemy was now a system, vast and mechanized, that turned the entire Atlantic into a gauntlet of sensors, eyes in the sky, and coordinated task forces designed specifically to find and kill submarines. The technological revolution had accelerated beyond the pace at which the U-boat service could adapt. Henke's boat, like others in the fleet, had been equipped with the new snorkel apparatus, allowing the diesel engines to run while submerged, eliminating the need to surface to charge batteries. This was meant to be salvation. Instead, it became merely a temporary reprieve. The Allies had developed high-frequency direction-finding sets that could detect the radio transmissions of U-boats with uncanny accuracy. They had radar systems so refined that they could locate a submarine's periscope in darkness. More devastating still, they had deployed long-range aircraft with sonobuoys and improved depth charges, turning entire stretches of the Atlantic into zones where a submarine could not safely surface to recharge its batteries, could not run on diesel without exposing its position, and could not remain submerged indefinitely because battery power had finite limits. The Germans had created an underwater killer. The Allies had created something far more dangerous, an entire ocean designed to kill it. The awareness of this transformation came to Henke not as a single moment of clarity, but as a gradual accumulation of near misses and narrow escapes. On his patrols through early 1944, he found that the convoys he located were less vulnerable than before. The escort screens had grown wider, the number of warships accompanying merchant traffic had increased, and the ships themselves had been fitted with better defensive weapons. More troubling still was the sudden appearance of aircraft, where aircraft had no business being, far from any Allied airfield, on patrol in waters where German estimates suggested they lacked the range to operate. The Allies had developed escort carriers, small flat decks that travelled with the convoys themselves, extending air cover across the entire breadth of the Atlantic. Where once Henke might have approached a convoy from the surface in darkness, striking at will, now the threat of aircraft presence meant that any surfaced U-boat could be attacked without warning. The losses among the U-boat fleet told their own story. In March of 1944, the Kriegsmarine U-boat service suffered what historians would later recognize as a watershed moment. In a period of just a few weeks, over 20 submarines were sunk in the Atlantic. The boats belonged to experienced commanders, men with proven records of success, operating under orders to pursue merchant shipping despite the mounting odds. Some were lost to coordinated attacks by escort groups. Others fell to aircraft. Many simply vanished without explanation, their fates unknown to this day. Each loss reverberated through the U-boat service as a warning that the old certainties no longer applied. The tactic that had worked 6 months earlier, the convoy attack at night, the surface approach, the swift strike, was increasingly a death sentence. Henke understood this with the clarity of a man who had survived through skill and calculation rather than luck. Many of his peers did not survive to develop the same understanding. What made this realization particularly acute for Henke was not fear of death, which a military officer in wartime had long since made peace with, but rather the growing recognition that individual skill no longer determined survival. Throughout his career as a submarine commander, Henke had built his reputation on tactical mastery, on reading conditions, on making the correct decision at the moment it mattered. He had studied how to use sea state to his advantage, how to read the bearing of a distant ship's smokestack, how to position his boat to achieve optimal firing angles. He had learned patience, the ability to shadow a convoy for hours, waiting for the moment when a gap appeared in the escort screen. These skills had made him one of the most successful U-boat commanders in service. But as 1944 progressed, he confronted the bitter knowledge that these abilities now counted for less and less. An aircraft could appear from cloud cover with mere minutes of warning. A sonobuoy could detect his submarine at distances that left no time for evasion. A coordinated task force using radar and radio direction finding could keep his boat pinned down beneath the surface, unable to surface, unable to move freely, unable to do anything but wait for the depth charges. The messages that filtered down from U-boat command, transmitted through increasingly unreliable communications, carried an undertone of desperation masked by operational language. Boats were being ordered to areas known to be heavily defended because the shipping lanes themselves had become treacherous everywhere. Young commanders with minimal experience were being sent to sea in aging boats because Germany lacked the resources to build replacements at the rate losses were mounting. The submarine arm that had entered 1944 with elaborate plans to rebuild its strength and resume major offensive operations instead found itself struggling for survival, month by month, losing more tonnage of vessels than it could replace, deploying more commanders than it could afford to lose. Henke had seen the U-boat service in its prime, when every patrol promised opportunity and danger in roughly equal measure. Now danger had become overwhelming, and opportunity had vanished into theory. What separated officers like Henke from lesser commanders during this catastrophic period was not optimism about eventual victory, which had become the province of the deluded or those protected by propaganda, but rather a continued commitment to duty, even as duty became increasingly futile. Henke was not a Nazi ideologue. He had never been politically engaged in any particular way. He was a naval officer, a technician, a man who had mastered a difficult craft in an extremely dangerous environment. But as the spring of 1944 arrived, and he prepared for what would be his final operational patrol, he carried the burden of certainty that the war Germany was fighting could not be won. The Allies possessed resources that were simply incalculable. They controlled the air. They controlled the sea. They possessed weapons that were being developed faster than German countermeasures could be engineered. No amount of courage from submarine crews, no quantity of successful patrols, could alter this fundamental imbalance. Yet Henke continued his work. This is perhaps the defining characteristic of his life as a fighting commander during this period. Despite the knowledge that his efforts contributed nothing toward any conceivable path to German victory, despite understanding that his boat and crew might become statistics in the already staggering casualty rolls, he continued to hunt. He continued to maneuver, to evade, to search for opportunities in a shrinking operational space. This was not bravery exactly, though bravery was surely required to remain in command of a submarine in 1944. It was something closer to professionalism in its most pure form, the continuation of duty even when victory has become impossible. Henke had trained for this work his entire adult life. It was what he did. The fact that doing it was now almost surely a path toward death changed nothing about his obligation to do it well. The technological arms race that had dominated submarine development for years now tilted decisively and permanently toward the Allies. The new German weapons that were promised, the revolutionary designs that were said to be in development, remained largely in design stages or prototype forms. The Type 21 U-boat, a far superior design that might have turned the tide, existed in numbers so small that it made no difference to the overall campaign. New weapons, new tactics, new equipment trickled down to operational boats in quantities far too limited to change the trajectory of the war. Henke's boat received the snorkel apparatus, which was something, but a snorkel could not make a submarine invisible to radar. It could not extend the finite limits of battery capacity. It could not make a slow, deep-diving boat faster or more maneuverable. Technology alone could not overcome the gap that now separated the capabilities of the Allies from those of Germany. In the minds of the highest commanders in the U-boat service, there existed throughout early 1944 a persistent tension between the operational reality they confronted daily and the strategic necessity to continue the campaign. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, maintained the public position that the submarine war remained winnable if sufficient resources were devoted to it, if boats were built fast enough, if losses could be minimized through improved tactics and technology. But even the greatest optimist among the senior leadership could not ignore the mathematics. The boats being sunk outnumbered replacements by an ever-widening margin. Experienced crews were irreplaceable because training took years and time was something the Kriegsmarine no longer possessed in abundance. The Allies were constructing escort vessels and aircraft faster than the Germans could build submarines to replace the ones being destroyed. The strategic offensive capability of the U-boat arm, which at its height in 1942 had seemed potentially capable of strangling British supply lines, was now defensive in nature. Boats were retained in the Atlantic primarily to tie up Allied resources that might otherwise be directed toward the invasion everyone knew was coming. Henke's awareness of this larger strategic picture would have been incomplete, gathered from fragmentary intelligence, from conversations with other commanders, from the drift of orders that came down from higher command. A submarine officer did not possess complete understanding of the war's overall state, but he possessed enough awareness to know that something fundamental had changed. The U-boat campaign had transformed from an offensive operation with some possibility of affecting the war's outcome into a holding action in a war that was already, for practical purposes, lost. This knowledge did not paralyze him. It did not make him hesitate, but it hung over every decision he made, every maneuver he executed, every moment he spent in command of his boat and the crew that depended on him. He was a skilled professional, conducting operations in a war that had already been decided by forces far beyond his control. All that remained to be determined was the precise timing of the catastrophe, and whether men like Henke would survive long enough to see it arrive. The spring of 1944 arrived with a peculiar quality of absence. Where once the Atlantic had teemed with merchant vessels moving in predictable patterns, where U-boat commanders could calculate intercept courses with almost industrial certainty, now the ocean had become something else entirely. The waters that had made Werner Henke's reputation were no longer yielding the bounty they once had. The easy days of the U-boat arm were finished. What remained was a kind of grim persistence, a refusal to acknowledge the mathematics of defeat, even as those mathematics grew more undeniable with each passing week. For Henke, however, this deterioration presented not a reason to surrender his post, but rather an opportunity to prove what he had always believed about himself, that his skill and discipline could succeed where others would fail. U-boat 415 departed for what would be Henke's final patrol in the Atlantic during the early weeks of that spring. The boat had undergone refits and modifications, as had all operational submarines by this stage of the war. The new snorkel technology allowed the boat to run its diesel engines while remaining submerged, a critical advantage as Allied aircraft had become the primary threat to submarines surfaced at night. The hydrophone arrays had been upgraded, their sensitivity improved, allowing Henke sound operators to detect the distant vibrations of ship propellers at greater distances than before. Yet for all these enhancements, Henke knew the fundamental situation had shifted. The Allies were no longer simply defending their supply lines. They were hunting. The Atlantic had become a theater of active warfare rather than a zone of commerce raiding, and every sortie now carried a weight of danger that was simply different from what had come before. The patrol route took U-boat 415 toward the eastern seaboard of North America, an area where merchant traffic still flowed despite the dangers. Henke's approach, as it had always been, combined patience with aggressive reconnaissance. He did not rush toward shipping lanes with the urgency of desperation. Instead, he moved with calculated deliberation, positioning his boat in areas where the geometric probabilities suggested merchant vessels might pass. His crew, by now largely composed of men who had served with him through multiple patrols, understood his methods. They had learned that Henke's silences and long periods of apparent inactivity were not signs of caution, but rather the deep concentration of a hunter waiting for the precise moment of advantage. The men trusted him because his methods had consistently resulted in success where other boats had been lost. The communications Henke received from U-boat headquarters reflected the increasingly desperate reality of the naval war. The number of operational submarines had declined, either through loss or through boats being pulled back to defend German ports, as the strategic situation worsened. Henke was informed of successful attacks by other boats, but these reports came less frequently now, and many of them involved losses. The wolf pack tactics that had proven so devastating in earlier years were becoming increasingly difficult to coordinate. The Allies had developed signals intelligence that allowed them to track U-boat movements with alarming accuracy. Henke had no way of knowing the full extent of this British success, but he could feel its effects in the narrowing of safe operational areas and the seemingly prescient appearance of escort vessels exactly where his boats had hoped to find undefended targets. Yet Henke's operational methodology remained unchanged. He understood that in the face of a deteriorating strategic situation, the only response was to increase professional rigor rather than decrease it. Every aspect of his patrol was conducted with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized all his previous missions. The boat's systems were maintained with obsessive precision. The crew was drilled repeatedly in emergency procedures. Henke's navigation was marked by careful attention to position and course, ensuring that no error of calculation would place his boat in a predictable location where Allied forces might be waiting. The discipline that had made U-Boat 415 successful in earlier, more target-rich environments was now being applied to the far more difficult challenge of hunting in contested waters. The hunting itself proved frustratingly limited during this patrol. Henke's sound operators detected the passing of merchant vessels at distance, and on several occasions he maneuvered his boat to attempt intercept courses. The encounters that resulted were characterized by the growing sophistication of Allied convoy defenses. Where once convoys had been protected by a handful of escort vessels, now they moved with multiple destroyers and corvettes, their dispositions coordinated with precision. Aircraft appeared with increasing frequency, their presence signaled by the distant sound of their engines, forcing Henke to dive and remain submerged for extended periods. The patience that had been a virtue in earlier operations now became a form of strategic paralysis. Henke could track ships moving across the ocean's surface, but the defenses surrounding them made successful attacks exponentially more dangerous than they had been even a year previously. The fatigue of extended patrol operations in these deteriorating conditions began to accumulate. For a commander like Henke, the strain was not primarily physical, but psychological. The weight of responsibility for a vessel and crew of more than 50 men was constant and unrelenting. He maintained his composure with the discipline that had become his professional signature, but the officers and senior petty officers who served closest to him could read the subtle signs of the mounting pressure. The optimism that had characterized earlier patrols, when the outcome of engagements seemed to favor the U-boat arm, had given way to a grim pragmatism. Henke was hunting not for glory or for strategic advantage, but out of a sense of duty and professional obligation. The question was no longer whether Germany could win the war, but whether individual officers could fulfill their responsibilities with honor, even as the broader cause collapsed around them. So, during one period of this final patrol, Henke's boat encountered what appeared to be a promising target. A merchant vessel was detected, moving at distance from the protection of a larger convoy. The parameters seemed favorable for an attack. Henke made the decision to pursue, maneuvering his boat into a position from which a successful torpedo run appeared possible. Yet as he prepared to execute the attack, additional escort vessels appeared, seemingly materializing from nowhere. The Allies had stationed picket ships and had clearly coordinated their dispositions in ways that suggested they were anticipating U-boat movements. What had once been a straightforward tactical problem now involved layers of complexity that made success increasingly uncertain. Henke broke off the attack and withdrew, recognizing that the marginal possibility of sinking a merchant vessel was outweighed by the significant risk of losing his boat. This incident was emblematic of the broader problem Henke confronted during this final patrol. The tactical advantages that had made him successful in earlier operations no longer existed. The Allies had achieved such superiority in detection technology, air power, and coordination that individual U-boats found themselves operating at an increasingly severe disadvantage. Henke's knowledge of this reality was incomplete, but his operational experience provided him with a clear understanding that the war at sea had fundamentally changed. The hunter had become the hunted, and the roles were no longer reversible through skill and determination alone. Henke continued to maintain his professional approach and his methodical hunting patterns, but the objective possibilities for success had contracted dramatically. The weeks of the patrol extended toward their conclusion, with minimal results to show for the effort expended. Henke's boat had detected numerous merchant vessels and had attempted several intercept courses, yet the circumstances surrounding each potential target had rendered successful attacks impossible. The combination of escort vessel deployment, aircraft coverage, and Allied radar capabilities created a defensive environment that was simply too hostile for an aging U-boat to penetrate with reasonable chances of survival. For Henke, the frustration of this situation was tempered by something approaching a philosophical acceptance. He had done everything in his power to position his boat and crew for success. The failure to achieve significant results reflected not a deficiency in his command, but rather the overwhelming material and technological superiority that the Allies had achieved. As the patrol moved toward its conclusion, orders began to arrive from headquarters regarding Henke's future assignments. The U-boat campaign was being restructured as the reality of defeat became impossible to deny. Boats were being recalled to German ports, where they would be employed in defensive operations or converted for other purposes. Henke received notice that U-boat 415 would be returning from patrol and would undergo modifications in preparation for new operational assignments in different areas. The final stages of his time at sea during this patrol were characterized by a kind of melancholic awareness that an era was ending. He had entered the U-boat service as a young officer during a time when Germany seemed poised for victory. He was returning from what would be his final combat patrol into waters where that victory had definitively failed to materialize. The journey back toward the port facilities where the boat would be refitted was conducted with the same attention to security procedures that had characterized the outbound passage. Henke remained alert for the possibility of Allied surface vessels or aircraft, recognizing that the threat did not disappear simply because the patrol was concluding. The crew, exhausted after weeks at sea in increasingly tense circumstances, maintained their vigilance. The routines that had structured life aboard the submarine continued, the small rituals and habits of men living in extreme proximity to one another, in a vessel that could become a coffin at any moment if the wrong decision were made. Yet there was a different quality to these final stages. Henke and his men were returning to harbours that were themselves becoming increasingly threatened by air raids and naval operations. They were returning not to triumph, but to the continuation of an enterprise that most of them now understood was doomed. The significance of this final patrol lay not in any dramatic success or spectacular failure, but rather in what it represented about the transformation of the U-boat war by 1944. Henke's reputation as a capable commander remained intact, yet the circumstances of warfare had evolved beyond the point where even the most skilled individual operator could overcome the systematic advantages that the Allies had achieved. The days of the Wolf Pack, the days of German submarines freely hunting across the Atlantic, the days when a commanding officer could achieve success through a combination of courage, skill, and aggressive tactics, those days were definitively finished. Henke himself had contributed to bringing about this state of affairs through his own previous successes, the tonnage he had sunk, the economic disruption he had caused. The irony was that his success had been one of the factors that had prompted the Allies to invest so heavily in anti-submarine capabilities that they had eventually rendered the entire U-boat campaign obsolete. As U-boat 415 approached harbour following this final patrol, the next chapter of Henke's life was already beginning to open before him, a chapter that would unfold in the ruins of the conflict, rather than in the battles that still continued to rage across the oceans of the world. The Atlantic in spring of 1944 was no longer the hunting ground Werner Henke had known. The ocean that had once offered corridors of darkness and the promise of solitary stalking had transformed into a contested realm where the hunter had become the hunted. Allied shipbuilding had finally overwhelmed German submarine construction, but more than mere numbers had shifted. The coordination of escort vessels, long-range patrol aircraft, and increasingly sophisticated detection equipment had created a lethal environment where the old tactics of stealth and patience offered diminishing returns. Henke understood this mathematics of attrition, perhaps better than most of his fellow commanders, and yet the Kriegsmarine demanded patrols continue, demanded that submariners press forward into waters that had become death traps. The U-boat arm was dying, but it had not yet learned to accept its mortality. U-boat 415 slipped beneath the surface on what would prove to be its final mission, carrying Henke and his crew of around 50 officers and enlisted men into the Atlantic. By this stage of the war, the submarine had become a vessel of contradictions, equipped with newer detection systems and countermeasures, yet operating in an environment where even the most advanced equipment could not overcome the simple fact of numerical inferiority and coordinated opposition. Henke's boat possessed a snorkel apparatus, allowing it to run its diesel engines while submerged at shallow depths, reducing the need to surface and risk detection. The Allies, however, had radar that could detect snorkels. The Allies had high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could locate a submarine's radio transmissions. The Allies had acoustic homing torpedoes, though these remained unreliable. Most of all, the Allies had patience, resources, and the cooperation of multiple navies working toward a single objective, the elimination of the German submarine threat. For weeks, Henke conducted his patrol with the methodical precision that had defined his career. He searched the convoy routes with the understanding that each potential target represented both opportunity and catastrophic risk. The shipping lanes had become narrower, more heavily defended, their schedules unpredictable. Henke had sunk more than 10 vessels across his previous patrols, earning him respect among the U-boat officer corps and a place in the Kriegsmarine's elite. Yet in the spring of 1944, such achievements belonged to a different era. He maintained his discipline regardless, studying weather patterns, calculating sea states, positioning his boat with the caution of a commander who had survived long enough to understand that survival itself was becoming the primary victory. His crew responded to his composure. Even in these final weeks of his operational career, Henke remained the calm authority at the center of their steel hull, surrounded by the sounds of machinery and the constant tension of men aware that detection could come at any moment. The encounter began not with visible ships, but with electronic signatures, the unmistakable pulse of active sonar emanating from somewhere beyond the limit of human perception. Henke recognized the sound immediately. This was the new generation of detection equipment, the kind that could locate a submarine through hundreds of meters of ocean. A hunter-killer group had found them. These were not scattered convoy escorts, but coordinated naval formations specifically designed to seek out and destroy submarines. The group likely included an escort carrier or converted destroyer transport equipped with aircraft, complemented by 3 to 5 escort ships armed with depth charges, hedgehogs, and the latest sonic equipment. The odds were not merely unfavorable, they were mathematically catastrophic. Henke ordered silent running, a procedure that meant shutting down all non-essential machinery, reducing the boat to a ghostly whisper of existence, hoping that electronic noise discipline might buy time. What followed was a sequence of hours in which the hunter-killer group conducted what had become a standard tactic: the expanding search pattern, coordinated sonar sweeps from multiple vessels, and the systematic reduction of ocean volumes until no hiding place remained. Henke maneuvered his boat with all the skill and intuition that had made him an ace, adjusting depth, altering course, attempting to exploit thermoclines and bathymetric features that might scatter or confuse the pursuing sonar. His crew operated under conditions of extreme psychological strain, moving through the boat in near silence, breathing quietly, performing their duties with the knowledge that any significant noise could betray their position. The men understood that modern anti-submarine warfare had fundamentally changed the nature of submarine combat. In the early war, a U-boat might evade pursuit through speed and diving ability. Now, the boats were being hunted by coordinated teams armed with detection methods that penetrated the water itself, making invisibility impossible. The stress of hours in silent running manifests physiologically in ways that peacetime describes poorly. Muscle cramps, dizziness from reduced oxygen, the grinding anxiety of confinement, while danger closes steadily from multiple directions. These formed the substrate of every submariner's nightmares. Henke moved through his boat, observing his men, ensuring that the youngest and most frightened understood that fear was a tool to be managed rather than indulged. He had trained them well. His crew had confidence in his judgment, confidence earned through patrols where his decisions had meant the difference between success and catastrophe. But no amount of confidence could overcome the reality that they were trapped in a metal tube 300 meters below the surface, surrounded by enemies armed with equipment that grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Then came the attack. One of the escort vessels made contact, a solid sonar return indicating the unmistakable profile of a submarine hull. The pattern of pings changed, becoming more intense, more focused. Henke knew that the hunter-killer group was now closing in for the kill. Depth charges fell from above, massive cylindrical explosives preset to detonate at specific depths, creating expanding spheres of pressure that could rupture a submarine's hull with terrifying efficiency. The first salvo detonated above or beside the boat, close enough that the crew felt the shockwave travel through the water and through the hull itself, a physical assault that sent men sprawling, shattered light bulbs, and triggered every alarm that indicated catastrophic damage. The boat took on a list, angling downward as water began to enter through compromised sections. Henke faced the decision that every submarine commander dreads: whether to continue the descent into deeper water where the pressure might crush the hull, or to surface and attempt to escape on the surface where the escort vessels and aircraft could attack with conventional guns and bombs. The damaged boat was losing buoyancy. The depth gauge showed that they were sinking beyond their safe operating depth. Another salvo of depth charges would finish them. He gave the order to surface. It was 1944, and the age of the German U-boat as an effective weapon was ending not in some climactic battle, but in the practical mathematics of coordinated anti-submarine warfare. U-boat 415 rose toward the sunlight that had become as much an enemy as the escort vessels above. As the boat broke the surface, sunlight flooded the conning tower and every available viewport. The crew received the order to abandon ship, and men began streaming up through the hatches into the cool Atlantic air. The escort vessels were visible now, grey shapes moving at high speed through the water, their guns already traversing toward the surfaced U-boat. Aircraft circled overhead, waiting for a clear target. The decision to surface had been correct. It was the only decision that offered any possibility of survival. Henke ordered the scuttling charges prepared, the demolition equipment that would ensure his boat would not fall into Allied hands, the boat that had made him an ace, that had carried him through multiple patrols in increasingly hostile waters, would be destroyed rather than captured. This too had become part of the calculus of submarine warfare by 1944, the destruction of one's own vessel to deny it to the enemy. The crew assembled on the narrow hull, clinging to whatever handholds offered security. Some men were injured from the depth charge attacks, yet all found their way into the water or onto rafts. The escort vessels approached carefully, their crews alert for any signs of resistance, their guns trained on the U-boat and the men in the water. What struck the submariners in those final moments was not fear, but a strange sense of conclusion, the feeling that a chapter had suddenly and definitively closed. Henke remained visible on the hull, watching as his boat filled with water and began its final descent. He had commanded her through successful patrols, through narrow escapes and tactical victories, through the progressive deterioration of the German position. Now she was gone, and with her went the final reality of his operational effectiveness. The skilled tactician, the ace who had hunted from a position of dominance, was now a prisoner, awaiting rescue from the very forces he had fought to evade. The rescue itself proceeded with the professional detachment that characterized naval warfare in its modern form. Allied sailors pulled German sailors from the water, separated officers from enlisted men, and prepared the survivors for transport to internment facilities. Henke understood immediately that his war as a combatant had ended. The submarines, the patrols, the tactical calculations, the careful positioning, and the successful attacks, all of it belonged to a phase of his life that would not resume. He would spend the remaining years of the war, and beyond, in the custody of Allied forces, separated from his homeland by an ocean that was no longer his to command. The transition happened in minutes. The shift from commanding officer of an active warship to prisoner of war dependent on the decisions of others. It was a psychological rupture as profound as any damage inflicted by depth charges, the sudden severance from purpose and authority that left men struggling to comprehend their new condition. The sinking of U-boat 415 represented something more significant than the loss of a single vessel or the capture of a skilled submarine commander. It was a microcosm of the larger catastrophe unfolding across the Atlantic. German submarines were being destroyed at an accelerating rate as Allied forces perfected the techniques of coordinated anti-submarine warfare. Henke had survived longer than many of his peers, had accumulated more confirmed successes, had maintained his effectiveness through skill and composure. Yet none of these advantages could protect him from the systematic application of superior resources and technology. The submarine war had reached its conclusion, not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of encounters exactly like the one that surrounded U-boat 415. Each day brought new losses, new boats forced to the surface, new crews led into captivity or death. Henke's final patrol symbolized the end of an epoch, the moment when individual skill and tactical excellence could no longer compensate for strategic exhaustion and numerical disadvantage. The waters that had made him an ace had ultimately enclosed him, and the hunter had become permanently the hunted. The Atlantic, in the spring of 1944, had become a graveyard. U-boat 415, crippled and surfaced, sat exposed like a wounded animal dragged into the open. Werner Henke stood on the conning tower as his crew scrambled through the hatch, abandoning the only home most of them had known for months. The sea around them was alive with activity, aircraft circling overhead, escort vessels closing in with methodical precision, and the terrible knowledge that resistance was futile. For a man who had spent the last 2 years hunting others across these same waters, the sudden reversal was almost incomprehensible. The hunter had become the hunted, and now the hunted had nowhere left to run. Around him, the men of his crew were jumping into the water, clinging to debris, their voices calling out across the swells. Henke remained composed, watching as the boat that had been his instrument and his responsibility sank beneath the waves. This was not the glorious end that propaganda had promised. This was simply the end. The rescue was swift and efficient, a stark contrast to the chaos of the sinking. Allied sailors pulled Henke and his men from the Atlantic with the practiced efficiency of those who had performed this grim task many times before. There was no gloating, no theatrical revenge, merely the professional execution of duty. A German U-boat commander, soaking wet and stripped of his authority, stood on the deck of an escort vessel, surrounded by men who had been hunting him and his kind across an ocean. Henke understood immediately that everything had changed. The uniform he wore, once a symbol of feared capability and elite status, now marked him as a prisoner. The men around him were not cruel in their treatment, but they were firm, and there was in their manner the quiet confidence of victors. He was searched, catalogued, and placed below decks in conditions that were austere but not brutal. The stark contrast between the respect afforded to him as a combatant moments before and his status now as a prisoner of war was disorienting in its speed. The interrogation began within hours. Henke was brought before officers who knew far more about him than he might have expected. They possessed records of his patrols, intelligence reports on his tactics, and estimates of his confirmed kills. There was a certain ironic respect in the way they approached him, treating him as a professional soldier rather than as a criminal or a monster. This too was a calculated decision. The Allies had learned that the most effective way to extract information from German officers was through appeals to military honor and the professional courtesy between warriors. Henke, for his part, was circumspect. He gave his name, rank, and serial number, and little else. He understood the protocols of captivity. Information, once released, could harm his remaining crew members still unaccounted for, and it could aid the enemy in their continuing war against other U-boats still at sea. The interrogators did not press him violently. They simply talked, presenting what they knew, allowing silence and implication to do much of the work. Henke remained largely silent in return, a trained officer enduring the predictable machinery of military questioning. What Henke could not endure with quite the same professional detachment was the emotional weight of defeat. Every confirmation of his capture meant the confirmation of something larger and more terrible. The boat was gone. Those men who had not survived the sinking or been rescued were gone. The war in the Atlantic, which he had understood and mastered through sheer professional competence, was over for him. More than that, he was beginning to understand through fragments of conversation among his captors that the larger war was itself tilting decisively against Germany. Allied officers spoke casually of operations being mounted in multiple theatres, of industrial capacity that made German production look almost quaint by comparison, of an inexorable grinding forward that no single German victory could have halted. For a man of Henke's era, raised with beliefs about German superiority and German destiny, this realization came with a peculiar dissonance. He had never been a fanatic or an ideologue. He was a technician, a professional military man who had done his job with competence and without excessive enthusiasm for the ideology that framed the war. But competence and professionalism suddenly seemed almost irrelevant when set against the scale of what was occurring. The transport ship that carried Henke and hundreds of other German prisoners across the Atlantic was itself a journey through the world he had lost. The voyage took more than a week, and prisoners were kept below decks in crowded conditions. It was not torture. The Americans treated prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention with scrupulous adherence, but it was confining and disorienting. Henke shared space with naval officers, army officers, enlisted men, and men of varying degrees of Nazi enthusiasm. The ship itself represented the vast American naval and transport capability that the Germans simply could not match. The fact of its existence, the casual efficiency of its operation, the endless supplies visible even to the prisoners, all testified to an industrial capacity that made the entire German war effort seem almost desperate in retrospect. Henke spent much of the voyage in a state that might best be described as contemplative numbness. He was alive, which was more than could be said for many men he had known. He was unharmed, which was also a form of fortune. But he was a prisoner in a foreign land, separated from his home by the very ocean that had been the stage of his professional life, and everything he had believed about the nature of the conflict in which he had participated was being methodically dismantled by the simple reality of American abundance and power. The camp where Henke was first processed in Europe was one of many hastily expanded facilities dealing with the steady stream of German prisoners. Here, he was formally entered into the system, assigned a prisoner number, issued clothing and bedding, and integrated into the broader population of captured military men. The transition from combatant to prisoner was given its administrative finality. Officers were separated from enlisted men, and there was established a clear hierarchy based on rank and service. Henke, as a Kapitän-Leutnant who had commanded a U-boat, occupied a position of modest prominence within the officer-prisoner hierarchy. This brought certain small advantages, somewhat better conditions, a degree of respect from both other prisoners and guards, and a measure of autonomy within the confined space of the camp. But it also brought a peculiar visibility. He was recognized by others in the camp. His reputation as a successful U-boat commander preceded him. Some men looked at him with what might charitably be called professional respect. Others looked at him with something more complicated, a mixture of respect for military competence and the dawning recognition that that competence had been deployed in service of a losing cause. The months in the European camp were, in many ways, the most disorienting of Henke's captivity. The war in Europe continued around him. He could hear, dimly, information about operations, about the progress of the Allies inland from Normandy, about the eventual collapse of German resistance in the West. These were the very operations that other U-boat captains were still attempting to disrupt, that men like himself would have been opposing had he not been captured. There was in this awareness a strange sense of being frozen outside the current of events. His war was over, finished in the moment when his boat sank and he was pulled from the Atlantic. But the war itself continued without him. New campaigns were being fought, new losses were being incurred, new victories were being claimed, and he was not part of any of it. He existed in a limbo of captivity, aware and helpless. The other prisoners provided some context and some distraction. There were men he could talk to, other naval officers, men who understood the particular experience of submarine service. But there was also an undercurrent of something more troubling in the camp. As the weeks passed and it became clear that Germany was truly losing, that defeat was not merely a possibility, but an approaching certainty, the political temperature among the prisoners began to shift. When Henke was transferred to North Africa several months into his captivity, the nature of his imprisonment changed in subtle but significant ways. The camps in North Africa were less regimented than those in Europe, and the population was more diverse. There were prisoners from multiple nations, multiple service branches, and multiple levels of ideological commitment to the Nazi cause. More importantly, as the European war drew to its conclusion and the full scope of German defeat became undeniable, the emotional and psychological world of the prisoner population became increasingly fractured. Some men accepted defeat with a kind of weary resignation. Others clung to hopes that the war might somehow continue, or that Germany might yet extract better terms from its conquerors. Still others were beginning to process the reality that they were not merely losing a war, but that the regime they had served was morally bankrupt in ways that went far beyond simple military failure. Henke remained largely aloof from these arguments. He performed his duties as a prisoner with the same methodical competence that had characterized his service as a naval officer. He was reliable, orderly, and non-confrontational, but there was in him during this period a growing sense of dislocation. The sea that he had mastered was gone. The career that had defined his adult life was gone. The nation he had served was in its final death throes, and he was suspended in a prison camp in Africa, waiting for a war to end that he could no longer influence or even witness. The notification came that he would be transferred to the United States. The news was delivered matter-of-factly by the camp administration, a bureaucratic announcement of an administrative transfer. But for Henke, as for many of the German prisoners receiving the same notification, it carried a profound weight. To be transferred to America was to be separated by an ocean from home in a way that was almost incomprehensible to a man who had never traveled far from Germany and the waters surrounding it. It was to be placed in a camp thousands of miles away, effectively unreachable, truly beyond any possibility of contact with family or homeland. The journey across the Atlantic, on a prisoner transport ship, was a kind of inverse of his final patrol as a combatant. Then he had been hunting in these waters, a predator moving through an hostile ocean. Now he was being transported through the same waters as a captive, cargo being moved from one warehouse to another. The voyage took weeks. The ship was crowded but reasonably well managed. The Americans treated their prisoners with a bureaucratic correctness that was almost mechanical in its fairness. But there was in it no kindness, no human regard, only the proper administration of regulations. Henke descended into a kind of waiting, a suspension between his past life and whatever was to come. Camp Shawnee in Oklahoma was situated in the flat, empty world of the American Midwest, as far from the sea as Henke had ever been. When he arrived in 1945, the European war was either very recent or essentially over, depending on precisely when his transfer was executed. The camp was one of many spread across the American heartland, facilities designed to house the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners that the United States had captured and would continue to capture as the European campaign concluded. The camp itself was large, efficient, and utterly alien. The flatness of the landscape was disorienting to a man accustomed to the contours of the Ruhr and the confines of a submarine. The heat was extreme, the isolation was absolute. The prisoners were organized in compounds, with officers generally separated from enlisted men, and with a clear military hierarchy maintained within the compound. Henke was assigned to the officers' compound. His reputation had preceded him. He was known as a U-boat ace, a man who had sunk multiple vessels and had survived until the very end. Some prisoners regarded him with respect. Others, increasingly, regarded him with something more complicated as the reality of German defeat settled into absolute certainty. The structure of the camp in Oklahoma was, in many ways, more comfortable than the camps in Europe and North Africa. The facilities were more permanent, the rations were adequate if not generous, and the American guards maintained order with professional efficiency. But the comfort was of a peculiar kind. It was the comfort of warehousing, of a system designed to contain and manage a population with minimum cost and maximum security. The days had a numbing routine: wake at a certain hour, meals at prescribed times, labor details or maintenance work, the evening locked in barracks. There were opportunities for education, for sports, for reading, for intellectual engagement. Some prisoners formed study groups, others played cards or chess. The camp even had a small library. For an educated man like Henke, these resources provided some form of occupation for the mind. But they could not fill the void that had opened with the ending of his service life and the severance from home. Letters from Germany were rare and difficult to obtain. News from the homeland came through official channels and was often weeks or months old by the time it reached the prisoners. Henke existed in a strange suspension, removed from time and event, waiting for a war to end that had already ended, waiting for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The prisoner population in the camp was not uniform in its political composition. There were men of genuinely Nazi ideology, true believers who continued to espouse party doctrine and viewed the American captors as enemies to be opposed even in captivity. There were ordinary soldiers and sailors who had served out of duty or conscription and harbored no particular ideological commitment. And there were men of varying degrees of sophistication about the nature of the regime they had served. Men whose understanding of Germany's crimes was evolving or developing, or in some cases deliberately suppressed. The camp administration was aware of these tensions. They maintained discipline, they separated the most vocal ideologues, and they worked to create an environment where serious political conflict could be minimized. But the camp itself, isolated in the American Midwest, became a microcosm of the broader German tragedy. Here in miniature were played out the same conflicts of conscience, of ideology, of loyalty, and of simple self-interest that were occurring throughout Germany itself as the full scope of defeat became clear. Henke existed within this complex social landscape as a figure of some prominence. His rank demanded respect. His combat record commanded admiration from some quarters. But his survival, his presence in the camp while other officers had been killed or were still missing, raised questions and created a certain ambiguity in his position. The months in Camp Shawnee stretched into the latter part of 1945. The European war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The regime that had organized the prisoners' lives and defined the framework of their service no longer existed. News came through official channels of what was being discovered in liberated camps, of the scale and nature of atrocities that had been committed in the name of the Reich. For a man like Henke, who had been a professional soldier rather than a true believer, the processing of this information was psychologically complex. He had not been an ideologue, he had been a technician, a military professional who had done his job. But the job itself had been. The moment Werner Henke's U-boat broke the surface in the spring of 1944, his life underwent a transformation more complete than any tactical maneuver he had ever executed. The hunter became the hunted no longer in the operational sense, but in a different capacity altogether. Stripped of command, separated from his crew, thrust into a world governed by regulations written in languages not his own. The transition from submarine commander to prisoner of war was not instantaneous in its psychological weight, though it arrived with the mechanical efficiency of Allied procedure. Within hours of capture, Henke found himself processed through a system designed to strip away rank, identity, and autonomy in equal measure. His uniform remained his own, as military convention required, but everything else, his authority, his purpose, his connection to the only life he had known since his youth, dissolved into the grey bureaucracy of captivity. What the war at sea could not accomplish in 5 years of relentless hunting and narrow escapes, capture had achieved in a single afternoon. The first weeks of his internment unfolded in European holding facilities, temporary structures crowded with other German military personnel in various states of shock and denial. Henke existed in a peculiar liminal space where the war still raged beyond the wire, yet he remained forever separated from it, a living anachronism caught between two worlds. Other officers recognized him, or at least recognized his reputation, whispered conversations that acknowledged his status as a successful U-boat commander even in the reduced circumstances of imprisonment. These acknowledgments carried a complicated weight, respect mixed with the brittleness of men confronting the reality that their nation's cause was deteriorating beyond hope of reversal. Guards observed him with the cautious attention reserved for high-value prisoners, aware that a man with his operational experience and knowledge represented intelligence value to the Allied forces. Henke himself appeared to settle into captivity with a stoicism that impressed those around him, accepting the conditions of his confinement without the bitter recriminations that consumed other German officers freshly captured. He maintained a certain dignity, a quality that stemmed not from arrogance but from a recognition that the war had moved beyond the point where individual protest or defiance carried any meaningful consequence. The camps themselves were austere, but not brutal in the fashion of the Eastern Front's nightmarish reputation. The Allies maintained standards of treatment for officer prisoners that, while strict and uncomfortable, fell within the boundaries established by international convention. Henke received no special privileges, nor did he appear to expect them, though his rank entitled him to certain considerations. He shared quarters with other German officers, many of them submarine commanders or surface vessel sailors whose careers had similarly been truncated by Allied naval superiority. These men formed a peculiar brotherhood, born not from shared ideology, but from shared experience. They had all operated in that narrow band of the war machine where technology, courage, and circumstance intersected in ways both magnificent and terrible. Conversations in the barracks ranged from nostalgic recollections of previous postings to anxious speculation about what the end of the war might entail for German prisoners held in Allied hands. Henke, by accounts of those who encountered him, spoke little of his own achievements, listening more than contributing to these discussions, a trait that suggested either humility or a deeper understanding that boasting meant nothing in a world turned upside down. As 1944 progressed into 1945, the reality of German military collapse became impossible to deny, even for those still clinging to hope. News filtered into the camps through guards, official announcements, and the grapevine that existed in all military institutions, regardless of circumstance. Henke absorbed this information with the same calm, analytical approach he had once applied to tactical problems in the Atlantic. The Third Reich was falling, its eastern territories collapsing before the Soviet advance, while its western strongholds crumbled under combined Allied assault from across the Channel. His fellow prisoners reacted with varying degrees of despair, anger, and resignation. Some withdrew into themselves, processing the magnitude of defeat in isolation. Others became argumentative, defending decisions long made, or questioning the judgment of leadership that had brought them to this point. Henke seemed to exist apart from these emotional extremes, not through coldness, but through an acceptance that had perhaps come easier to him than to officers who had spent the war at headquarters or in relatively safer postings. He had stared into the abyss of probability for 5 years, making decisions in the face of impossible odds. Captivity held fewer unknowns than the Atlantic had ever offered. In 1945, Henke was transferred, along with thousands of other German prisoners, across the Atlantic to North America. The journey itself was surreal for men who had spent years fighting the convoy routes and the escort vessels that protected them, now traveling as prisoners aboard ships moving through waters they might have hunted in different circumstances. The camps in North America represented a different scale of confinement, vast, sprawling facilities designed to house thousands rather than the smaller European installations. Camp Shawnee in Oklahoma, where Henke would ultimately be stationed, reflected the American approach to prisoner management: organized, efficiently administered, and sufficiently remote that escape appeared virtually impossible. The facility itself was not harsh by the standards that men like Henke would come to know, but it was thoroughly isolating. The world of Oklahoma bore no resemblance to the Ruhr, or the Baltic, or the Atlantic he had once commanded. The sky seemed larger there, the horizons more distant, the sense of enclosure paradoxical despite the open space surrounding the compound. Henke's conduct as a prisoner appears to have been exemplary by conventional measures. He obeyed regulations, caused no disciplinary problems, and maintained the bearing expected of a German officer. This deportment was not a calculated performance designed to earn privileges or favorable treatment. It was rather a continuation of the professional attitude that had defined his military service. He was a captain without a ship, and the camp became his operational environment, requiring the same attention to protocol and chain of command that had governed his submarine. Fellow prisoners noted that he seemed genuinely interested in the welfare of other German military men, and he earned a reputation as someone who could be approached for advice or assistance in navigating the complexities of camp administration. This reputation would prove to be consequential, though not in ways that Henke could have anticipated. His accessibility, his perceived fairness, and his status as a respected military figure transformed him into something more than simply another prisoner. He became, in the eyes of some, a representative of a certain military tradition and values. The nature of imprisonment in North American camps differed fundamentally from that in Europe, in subtle but significant ways. The camps were larger, more thoroughly organized, and more completely removed from the theater of war. European camps existed under the constant shroud of military operations still occurring beyond their perimeters. In Oklahoma, the war felt distant, almost abstract. This distance created a peculiar psychology among the prisoners. With the fighting occurring an entire ocean away, conversations naturally turned toward contemplation of what lay beyond the war, what might happen to Germany, and what awaited the men when they eventually returned to their homeland. For many prisoners, these were anxious questions without satisfying answers. The Soviet Union had entered German territory from the east, raising the terrifying prospect that prisoners of war held by Western allies might face deportation to the Soviet sphere after the war's conclusion. This anxiety manifested in various ways, from quiet desperation to increasingly rigid ideological positions among certain prisoners who clung to nationalist sentiment as an anchor against uncertainty. The camps themselves contained a microcosm of the larger conflicts tearing German society apart. Not all prisoners were simply soldiers awaiting repatriation. Among them were committed Nazi Party members, SS personnel, and various levels of ideological commitment, ranging from enthusiastic to perfunctory to completely absent. These different populations did not coexist seamlessly. Tensions emerged between those who still believed in National Socialist ideology and those who viewed the entire enterprise with bitter disillusionment. Henke's own political orientation, his genuine beliefs about the regime he had served, remains difficult to establish with precision through available records. He was not, by any account, a fanatic. He was a professional military officer who had executed his duties within the system that existed. But in the hothouse atmosphere of the camps, such distinctions meant little to ideologically motivated prisoners. A man who commanded respect and exercised calm authority became a figure around whom conflicts could crystallize, particularly if his exact beliefs were not explicitly visible. Henke's interactions with his captors appeared to be professional and correct on both sides. The American guards and officers running Camp Shawnee had no cause to regard him as problematic. He represented the category of prisoner most preferred by camp administrators, disciplined, cooperative, and unlikely to cause administrative difficulties. This status, ironically, made him less of a security concern than some other prisoners, and therefore less carefully observed in certain respects. The American approach to prisoner management differed from both German and Soviet practices, emphasizing organization and regulation over ideology or punishment. Henke seemed to adapt to these conditions with the same pragmatism that had characterized his approach to professional challenges throughout his life. He occupied a prisoner-of-war barrack, participated in the organized routines of camp life, and maintained a social position that reflected his rank and his reputation among other prisoners. Officers often occupied positions of relative privilege within camps, recognized as leaders whose authority could be harnessed to maintain order among larger groups of enlisted men and junior personnel. The passage of months in confinement, even confinement that was not overtly brutal, carries its own weight. Henke had spent his formative adult years at sea or in preparation for service at sea. The structured but monotonous environment of a prisoners of war camp could not have been comfortable for such a man, yet he endured it as he had endured the pressures of command at sea, with an apparent equanimity that suggested either deep emotional resilience or perhaps a kind of detachment born from the recognition that individual comfort mattered very little in the larger scheme of circumstances. He would have understood that the war was finished, that Germany's defeat was absolute, and that his role in shaping events had concluded with the sinking of his submarine. The future held uncertainty, but uncertainty was not new to him. It was, in fact, the fundamental condition of the life he had lived since first assuming command of his boat. His time in captivity as a prisoner of war represents a peculiar interlude in his life. neither his combat career nor the tragedy that awaited him, but a holding period in which one chapter had definitively closed while another had not yet begun. He existed in suspension, a skilled operator of complex systems now operating within systems far simpler and far more rigid. The camps were stable, knowable, and required only obedience and patience. For a man who had navigated the Atlantic in a steel tube under constant threat from forces both mechanical and meteorological, the prospect of merely surviving day by day in a fixed location might have seemed almost restful. Yet the camps contained within themselves the seeds of conflicts that would become far more dangerous than anything the Allies had posed to his submarine. The community of prisoners, marked by ideological divisions and competing visions of what Germany and its people might become, created tensions that grew more volatile as the war's conclusion approached, and men contemplated the repatriation awaiting them. Henke's position as a respected officer, his accessibility, and his apparent decency made him a figure of significance in these increasingly fraught dynamics, though he could not have known that his greatest danger lay not in the depths of the Atlantic, but in the barracks and compounds of Camp Shawnee. The Atlantic that Werner Henke had once commanded now became a barrier he could no longer cross. In the spring of 1945, with the war in Europe accelerating toward its conclusion, the prisoner of war named Henke was loaded onto a transport ship bound for the United States. The voyage took him across the very waters where he had hunted merchant vessels and dodged destroyer escorts. But this time he was cargo rather than hunter. The irony was not lost on men who knew his history. Below deck, surrounded by other German prisoners, Henke faced a journey of nearly 2 weeks into captivity on the far side of the world. The ship carried hundreds of soldiers and sailors, some broken by their experiences, others defiant, and a few, like Henke, bearing the quiet weight of knowing exactly how the world had shifted beneath their feet. As the coastline of Europe receded, he watched it disappear with the understanding that he would not see it again for years, if ever. The arrival at an American port was itself a peculiar shock. The scale of American industrial capability, the sheer abundance visible in the ports and rail yards, confirmed what many German officers had suspected, but few had been allowed to acknowledge aloud. Henke and thousands of other prisoners were processed through receiving facilities, their possessions catalogued, their ranks recorded, their fates distributed among the various camps scattered across the continental United States. The American system was methodical and, by the standards of wartime captivity, relatively humane. Henke was neither beaten nor starved. He was registered, assigned a number, and transported by rail deeper into the interior. The journey inland carried him further from any possibility of escape, away from the coasts, into the heartland of the nation he had fought against. As the landscape changed from coastal fog and Atlantic winds to the dry plains of Oklahoma, Henke was transported toward what would be his prison and, ultimately, his final destination. Camp Shawnee occupied a remote corner of the Oklahoma landscape in 1945, a facility constructed specifically to house German prisoners of war. The camp was orderly in the American fashion, with barracks arranged in neat rows, barbed wire defining clear boundaries, and guard towers positioned to observe all movement. For a military man like Henke, the physical structure of the camp held a certain familiarity. Hierarchies were visible, order was enforced, and the rules were explicit. He was assigned to a barracks with other German officers and enlisted men, a mix of naval personnel, soldiers, and men from the Luftwaffe. The Oklahoma heat was brutal and foreign to his experience, drying the throat and sapping energy in ways the Atlantic had never done. The camp's isolation was profound, The nearest town was miles away, accessible only through the perimeter gates, and the open prairie beyond the fences offered no cover and no promise of successful escape. In this vast landscape, Henke found himself more imprisoned than he had ever been, not by walls alone, but by distance and the simple geography of being in a country where he was utterly foreign. Daily life in the camp followed a rigid structure dictated by American military regulation and the demands of managing several hundred prisoners. Work details assigned prisoners to various tasks: maintenance, construction, kitchen duties, and labor that supported the camp's operations. Henke, despite his rank and status, was not exempt from participation in these duties. There was an unspoken protocol among the prisoners regarding rank and privilege, but the Americans maintained clear boundaries about what distinctions they would permit. Henke's experience as a U-boat commander, his service record, and the respect he commanded among other German officers gave him a certain standing within the prisoner community. However, the isolation of being in a foreign country, separated by an ocean from everything he had known, tempered any satisfaction such status might have offered. The monotony of captivity weighed on all the prisoners, but for a man whose entire adult life had been defined by action, by command, by the focused intensity of submarine warfare, the enforced idleness was its own form of psychological warfare. The days blended together under the Oklahoma sun, each one indistinguishable from the last. The camp's population was not monolithic in its experience or its political allegiance. German prisoners included men who had seen the worst of the war, who had surrendered with relief, and who harbored no illusions about Nazi ideology. Others remained committed to the regime, even in defeat, and carried their convictions into the camp's enclosed world. The presence of these different orientations created a complex social dynamic that American guards monitored carefully. Henke inhabited an interesting position within this spectrum. His reputation was built on professional competence and operational success, not on ideological fervor. He had been a superb naval officer and a skilled tactician. His kills had been tallied and respected as the achievements of a trained warrior. But he had also survived the realities of the war at sea, had experienced firsthand the overwhelming material and technological superiority of the Allies, and had witnessed the transformation of the Atlantic into a hunting ground where U-boats became hunted prey. This combination of factors had shaped his thinking in ways that were not openly discussed, but were understood through subtle communication among men who had served together. The question of loyalty and ideology became increasingly fraught as the war's end approached and then passed into history. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the reality of defeat became absolute and inescapable. For some prisoners, this moment opened a possibility for reconciliation with their captors and a gradual reconstruction of identity beyond the Nazi regime. For others, defeat was intolerable, and the prison camp became a microcosm where competing visions of what Germany had been and should have been played out in miniature. Henke's wartime service had made him a figure of respect and even admiration among many prisoners. He represented a tradition of German military professionalism that existed in the minds of many officers separately from the political machinery of the Nazi state. This was a convenient mythology, and Henke had benefited from it. However, as the camp's population grappled with the fact of total defeat, this comfortable distinction became harder to maintain. Questions arose, spoken in low voices or through meaningful silences, about loyalty and betrayal, about what it meant to have served, and about what German military men owed to the reality of what the war had been. The physical conditions at Camp Shawnee, while austere, were not cruel by the standards of wartime captivity. Prisoners received adequate rations, though the food was bland and nothing like what they had known in Germany. Medical care was available. The guards maintained discipline without excessive brutality. However, the camp's location in rural Oklahoma meant that any prisoner who attempted escape would be attempting to flee across open country, with no supplies, no knowledge of the landscape, and no way to reach a sympathetic population. The impossibility of escape was built into the camp's placement as much as into its fences and watchtowers. For men like Henke, who had spent years operating in the Atlantic's vast but structured environment, the open prairie offered only death or capture. The psychological effect of this trapped condition was profound, even if it was not accompanied by the physical brutalities that marked other camps. The mind adapted to captivity as the body adapted to the Oklahoma climate, but adaptation was not the same as acceptance. Henke's interactions with his American captors reflected a professional courtesy that was mutual if not warm. The officers who commanded the camp understood that they were holding prisoners who had been regular military personnel, men who operated within their own code of conduct and honor. Henke presented no disciplinary problems. He followed regulations, maintained his uniform and appearance to the extent that captive circumstances permitted, and comported himself with the dignity that his rank and experience demanded. The American guards, in turn, treated him with the respect due to a military officer of some standing. This mutual professionalism created a strange détente within the camp's barbed wire boundaries. Yet beneath this surface propriety lay unspoken tensions. Henke had killed American merchant sailors and military personnel. Some of the guards may well have lost family members to the submarine war. The courtesies exchanged were real, but also a thin layer of civilization overlaying the fundamental reality that these men had been enemies trying to kill one another not long before. The war had ended, but the history of the war remained, embedded in every interaction between captors and captive. The passage of months in the camp blurred together into a routine that had no clear endpoint. Henke did not know, nor could he have known with certainty, how long his captivity would last. Rumors circulated about what would happen to German prisoners as the post-war occupation began, as trials of war crimes were conducted in Nuremberg and elsewhere, and as the Cold War's contours began to emerge from beneath the ashes of the old conflict. Some prisoners would be repatriated relatively quickly. Others would remain in captivity for years. A small number would face prosecution for crimes. Henke's status as a submarine officer gave him a certain vulnerability. The conduct of the U-boat war, and particularly questions about the treatment of survivors from sunken vessels, had drawn Allied attention. However, his record did not include documented atrocities or violations of maritime law that rose to the level of war crimes. His kills had been at distance, conducted according to the operational protocols of submarine warfare. He had not machine-gunned lifeboats or committed acts of deliberate cruelty beyond the violence inherent in warfare itself. In this sense, he occupied a middle ground, neither a minor figure nor a major war criminal. The other German prisoners provided both companionship and the seeds of future conflict within the enclosed world of the camp. Officers tended to socialize with officers, enlisted men with enlisted men, and the traditions of military hierarchy persisted even behind barbed wire. However, the shared experience of captivity created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Men who had fought in different theaters, in different branches of service, and under different commands, found themselves bound together by their common status as German prisoners in America. Yet this unity was fragile and riven with ideological fault lines that only widened as the reality of Nazi Germany's complete defeat became impossible to deny or rationalize. Henke's position among his peers was that of a respected figure who had achieved real success in his chosen field, but also a man whose perspective had been shaped by operational reality rather than ideology. This made him neither fully trusted by the ideologically committed, nor fully accepted by those who were beginning to reckon honestly with what the regime had been and what Germany had become. He existed in a space between these groups, respected but isolated, admired but also increasingly suspect. The ocean that Henke had once crossed and recrossed now separated him from any possibility of return. The distance was not merely geographic, but temporal and emotional as well. The man who had commanded a submarine through the Atlantic's depths was now confined to a prisoner's barracks in a world of flat plains and endless sky. The war had ended, but the wound of captivity remained open and raw. Around him, the camp continued its rhythms of work and waiting, of men gradually accepting the reality of their new existence and the need to imagine futures that were still unclear. Henke's professional service had been extraordinary by any measure, and it had ended not in victory, but in capture and displacement. The irony of his current situation, imprisoned in the country whose might he had sought to challenge through submarine warfare, separated by an ocean that had once been his domain, would have been bitter beyond measure to contemplate. Yet the greatest ironies were still to come, waiting in the tensions and conflicts that would emerge in the months ahead as various visions of German identity and responsibility collided within the camp's boundaries. The spring of 1945 turned into summer, and the Oklahoma heat pressed down on the camp with unrelenting force. Prisoners adapted to the climate as human beings adapt to circumstances, but adaptation was a form of slow erosion of the self. Henke remained physically intact, but psychologically altered by captivity in a foreign land, separated from the possibility of going home, unable to see an end to his imprisonment, or to envision clearly what his future might contain. The war was over, but for Werner Henke, the struggle continued in a different register, not against enemy forces, but against the simple human weight of isolation, displacement, and the knowledge that everything he had built his identity upon had been erased by military defeat. The camp's orderly structures provided the physical framework of his captivity, but within those structures, the real drama of his remaining months would unfold in interactions with the men around him, in the emergence of conflicts that transcended national boundaries and touched on fundamental questions of loyalty, betrayal, and what it meant to survive when survival itself became a matter of shame or danger. The camp sprawled across the Oklahoma prairie like a wound that would not close. By the middle of 1945, Camp Shawnee held more than 5,000 German prisoners of war, a tide of defeated men confined behind wire fences under the watchful eyes of American guards. For Werner Henke, the transition from the command chair of a submarine to the dust and monotony of internment in a foreign land was a descent into a different kind of warfare. The Atlantic had been his domain, a vast arena where skill and nerve determined survival. But here, in the barbed wire compounds of rural Oklahoma, a man's fate was increasingly determined not by Allied depth charges or fighter aircraft, but by the shifting allegiances and violent ideologies of his own countrymen. The U-boat war had ended for Henke on the surface of the ocean, but another battle, more intimate and more treacherous, was only beginning to take shape. The camp itself was a study in organized confinement, rows of barracks stretched in precise lines across the flat terrain, creating a miniature city of captivity where thousands of men were forced to confront both their defeat and each other. The American commandants ran the facility with a degree of efficiency and relative humanity that would have been unimaginable in the prisoner camps operated by Germany or Japan. Men received adequate rations, access to fresh water, and shelter from the elements. Yet no amount of physical adequacy could mask the profound psychological reality. These were men far from home, their nation vanquished, their cause lost, many uncertain whether they would ever see their families again. The material conditions of Camp Shawnee were tolerable, but the interior world of the camp, the invisible architecture of rank, ideology, and personal survival, was far more complex and dangerous than any concrete barrier or fence. Among the 5,000 prisoners, a rigid social hierarchy had calcified with the precision of a military organization. Officers like Henke occupied a peculiar position within this hierarchy, neither fully integrated with the enlisted men nor truly equal to one another. The German Navy had always maintained distinct class distinctions, and those divisions did not dissolve simply because the men wore the same grey uniforms and shared the same compound. More troubling still was the ideological fracture that had begun to splinter the camp's population. Some prisoners had begun to accept, with varying degrees of resignation, that National Socialism had failed and that Germany's future would require a fundamental reckoning with its past. Others clung to Nazi doctrine with desperate intensity, as if sheer force of belief could somehow resurrect a 1,000-year Reich that had burned itself into ash. These competing worldviews did not coexist peacefully. They collided daily in the crowded barracks, in the mess halls, in the work details that occupied the prisoners' daylight hours. The Wehrmacht officers, as a group, occupied an uneasy middle ground. They had been soldiers, trained to follow orders and to view the war through the lens of professional military duty rather than ideological fervor. Many of them, particularly those who had spent the latter years of the conflict commanding men in increasingly desperate circumstances, harbored quiet doubts about the regime they served. Yet voicing such doubts carried tremendous risk. Within the camp, a network of hardcore Nazi party members, many of them drawn from the SS and political officers, had begun to enforce a code of loyalty with brutal efficiency. Men who suggested that Germany's cause was lost, who expressed sympathy with the Allies, or who advocated for cooperation with the American authorities, risked being labeled as traitors. And in the closed world of Camp Shawnee, being branded a traitor could mean far more than social ostracism. It could mean physical violence, and in the most extreme cases, death. Henke found himself caught in the cross-currents of this internal conflict in ways that were both predictable and deeply troubling. As a Kapitänleutnant, he commanded respect among the other officers and many of the enlisted men. His reputation as a skilled U-boat commander preceded him, a man who had hunted vessels across the Atlantic and who had survived longer than most in a branch of service where survival was never assured. This stature gave him influence, but it also made him a figure of intense scrutiny. The ideological hardliners in the camp saw him as a potential ally, a decorated officer whose prestige could lend legitimacy to their continued insistence that Germany could somehow recover from its present collapse. More moderate prisoners, conversely, looked to officers like Henke as potential voices for reason, men who might counsel patience, cooperation, and a realistic assessment of their situation. Henke himself occupied this impossible space, trying to maintain his dignity and authority without aligning himself too completely with either faction. The tensions within the camp manifested in countless small confrontations and a handful of more serious incidents. Prisoners were segregated by their perceived loyalty, with known or suspected anti-Nazis kept separate from the hardcore faithful. These partitions were maintained not by American guards, but by the prisoners themselves, through an elaborate system of social pressure and occasional violence. Men who questioned the regime were subjected to whispered accusations, to ostracism in the mess hall, to being frozen out of work details that might provide marginal improvements in their conditions. In the barracks at night, arguments erupted over politics, over the conduct of the war, over whether Hitler had been a genius or a catastrophe. Some of these disputes remained verbal, heated but ultimately harmless. Others escalated into physical confrontations, fistfights that the American authorities would eventually break up, though not always with particular urgency. The guards understood that a certain degree of internal conflict was inevitable and, perhaps, even beneficial. A camp divided against itself was less likely to pose a unified security threat. Henke's response to this fractious environment was characteristically measured and professional. He maintained cordial relationships with officers from both the Wehrmacht and the Navy, men he had served alongside or knew from before the war. He attended the formal gatherings that the officer corps organized, small ceremonies and formal dinners that attempted to recreate